What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto was captured by Kunoichi who wanted his Uzumaki bloodline? If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments. Konohagakure. Hai no Kuni. The 5th of May. Konohagakure no Sato was peaceful in the early hours of May 5th. The villagers were still asleep in their beds, safe in knowing that their walls and homes were protected by very capable shinobi. Their eyes wouldn't open for another hour or so, when they needed to get up and open their shops and stalls. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, and the entire city was quiet and dark. The gates of Konoha were drowned in the faint mist that came only in the early mornings. 2 shinobi were guarding it, looking more asleep than awake. One had his head tucked onto his chest, dozing lightly, while the other leaned against a wall, doing her best to stay awake. Being as drowsy as they were, neither of them noticed the strangers until they were in front of them. 1. The shinobi knew instantly, the legendary Gama-sanin, Jiraiya-sama. He had always been known for his long ponytail of spiky white hair, his outlandish clothes, and the 2 red tear trails that fell from his eyes and down his chin. On his back was the scroll that allowed him to summon the great Gamabunta, Lord of the Toads. However, his companion hadn't been seen before in Konoha. Underneath a dirty white bandana the Kunoichi could see spiked blonde hair, a color rarely seen in Konoha. Cat-like deep blue eyes peeked out from the stray bangs that had fallen out of his headband, and the Kunoichi could see sharp whisker-like marks on either side of his mouth. He was dressed in a white haori, whose sleeves were pulled up to reveal bandaged arms, and a black hakama which covered his geta-clad feet. Dressed in traditional clothing as he was and with a long katana on his back, the boy almost looked like a wandering samurai. Both shinobi were instantly on alert. Jiraiya-sama may have been trustworthy, but they did not recognize his companion. However, the large man laughed when he noticed their suspicious looks, slapping the back of his slightly shorter companion. Said boy scowled and glared up at the renowned Gama-sanin, muttering something that sounded suspiciously like "Ero Senin" underneath his breath. "Ohayo gozaimasu," Jiraiya said in a formal tone, dropping into a short bow. "I would like to speak to Sandaime-sama please. It's urgent." The Kunoichi nodded but eyed the blonde boy suspiciously. "You may go in, Jiraiya-sama, but we need to know your companion's identity before he can be allowed inside." She couldn't help the feeling that the strange boy looked familiar. Nobody noticed the sudden tensing of the blonde boy's shoulders, or how his hand formed a fist so hard that a few drops of blood fell silently to the ground from it. However, after a few moments of awkward silence, the boy smiled a huge, bright, blinding smile. Later the male shinobi would say that Maida Guy and his protege Rock Lee could learn a few things about blinding smiles from this boy. And, since both men were the masters of the good guy pose, that was saying something. Uzumaki Naruto, the now-named boy said slowly, returning to the village after 8 years' absence. Both shinobi tensed even more, and the male guard was now completely awake, his head itching for his kunai case. The female found her hand on the hilt of her short dagger, her chakra spiking wildly with alarm. Uzumaki Naruto had been born in the village 14 years ago, on the night of the dreaded Kyuubi attack. Sandaime had announced after the survivors had emerged from the ashes, that Yondaime had sacrificed himself to seal the demon into a small orphan child. He had gone on to tell about Yondaime's last wish that the boy would be known as a hero. But most of the remaining villagers ignored him, instead glaring at the bundle with blonde hair in his arms. Hate was already gnawing away at their hearts, fueled by the fear of the Kyuubi and the grief for their lost loved ones. The little cantainer's name was etched into the villagers' minds, always there to spit at and loathe and detest with a passion. Uzumaki Naruto. Uzumaki had lived in the village for 6 years, this the Kunoichi guard knew. He had been shunned by the villagers, treated cruelly by them, and she knew that the night before his disappearance, the civilians had ganged up on him and beaten him to a near-death-like state. She had, after all, watched them, silently cheering them on and not interfering with the beatings. Why would she after all? She had left before the end though, continuing with her patrol with a jaunty stroll and cheery whistle. The next day, the boy had disappeared. There had been an outrage. What if he comes back to kill us all? But eventually it died down, and the villagers began to forget him. Even some of the shinobi had failed to remember his existence, and since the search had been called off years ago, Nobody really thought of him anymore except for, perhaps, the Hokage. And now the forgotten demon was back and with the great Jiraiya-sama. The Sannin smiled and placed a hand on the younger boy's shoulder. Now if you could please step aside. I have important things to talk about with Sandaime-sama. No, the male guard's voice was hard as ice. You may go in, Jiraiya-sama, but the demon stays out. Jiraiya's dark brown eyes hardened and the Kunoichi could see him restraining a glare at her companion. She also noticed the silent tensing of the demon's shoulders and prepared herself for an attack. To her surprise, none came, and she glanced at his face to see a huge smile on his face. It's all right, Ero Sennin, both shinobi gasped at the rude nickname. Go inside. You need to get your information to Jiji-sama. The Gamma Sannin's hand tightened on his companion's shoulder. Naruto, you're coming in with me. Sarutobi-sensei will want to see you as well. He's not entering this village, the Kunoichi spoke, her eyes hardening. We won't allow a demon like that to enter and defile our peaceful village once again. Naruto's eyes hardened and the Kunoichi could see him barely restraining to pounce at her. This thought made her hand tighten on her dagger's hilt, and set her thoughts in stone. This demon wouldn't be allowed in Konoha, not if her life depended on it. If this brat was going to go on a killing spree, innocent people would be caught in the rush. She wouldn't allow that to happen. Jiraiya, however, had other ideas. I need to give important information to Sandaime-sama, and the brat is my apprentice. He goes where I go. By denying him entrance you are also forbidding me entrance. The Sannin's voice was hard and suddenly the two guards could see glimpses of why people feared to meet the great Jiraiya-sama in battle. The Kunoichi allowed her hand to drop from her dagger's hilt, but still kept her eyes on Uzumaki at all times. Quickly she gestured to her partner to stand down. As much as she hated this spawn, she couldn't disobey or aggravate Sandaime or Jiraiya. It annoyed and frustrated her to no end, but unless the brat showed clear malicious intent she couldn't keep him from entering. Damn stupid laws, she thought helplessly, gesturing for both men to enter, if it wasn't for them. Jiraiya nodded in satisfaction when he saw both guards, however reluctantly, stand down and stand aside. Pulling his newest idiot pupil with him, he marched to the gates and stepped inside Konoha for the first time in 14 years. He was stubborn as a mule, clever as a monkey, and nimble as a hare. Louis Pergo. Sarutobi was not having a good day. He had fallen asleep at the office last night, like he had done many times before, and now he had a crick in his neck from sleeping in an uncomfortable position, and ink on his face from the paperwork he had been reading over before sleep overcame him. His clothes were wrinkled, and his Hokage hat was turned sideways on his head, the thin cloth veil covering his eyes so he couldn't see. His pipe was nowhere to be found, and the ash from its hollow was spread everywhere, making his desk and office a mess. He groaned slightly as a knock sounded on his door, waking him from his half-dozing state. Glancing sleepily at a nearby clock, he nearly cursed when he read the time. Who in their right mind would come up to the tower at 5 in the morning? Rubbing his head in exasperation and weariness, Sarutobi gave a quiet call for the person behind his door to enter. His door exploded open, revealing a grinning white-haired man waving a victory sign and holding a small orange book in one of his hands. The white-haired Hokage gave a small groan as he watched his ex-student Jiraiya enter the room, opening the little orange book and gaining a nosebleed from the contents in the process. Jiraiya, he said wearily, rubbing the part of his cheek where he could feel ink, what are you doing here? Your last message said you were gathering information by Iwa. The Sannin grinned mischievously, a look Sarutobi had learned to be suspicious and wary of. But sensei, the younger man whined, I found something interesting. The old man's eyes sharpened and he sent his student a curious look, interesting? Jiraiya nodded then glanced back at the door, huffing slightly and muttering something that sounded like, stupid Gaki, underneath his breath. Oi, Gaki, get in here, I'm coming ya old pervert, a young obviously male voice said from behind the closed door. Sarutobi stifled a giggle at the irritable sentence. When was the last time he had called Jiraiya called an old pervert by anyone other than Tsunade? He smiled slightly, he had a feeling he would like this person that Jiraiya brought with him. The door slammed open, Sarutobi winced slightly. He might have to get his poor door rehinged from all the abuse it went through, and a boy stepped inside, probably no older than 14 or 15. All the Hokage could see was the traditional samurai clothing, which he looked at with a raised eyebrow, and shoulder-length, shaggy blonde hair covered by the white bandana. He took note of the sword with caution, and eyed the bandaged arms and scrolls dangling on his belt with a barely concealed curiosity. Then the boy lifted his head, and Sarutobi gasped, his eyes widening with surprise and shock. The boy's shoulder-length blonde hair was mostly covered by a dirty white bandana, with only a few thick strands left to fall across his face and the back of his neck. His sharp cerulean eyes were serious, but they had a hint of mischief and childish glee hidden within the blue depths. He had a handsome face with high, prominent cheekbones, a slender nose, and a high forehead which was covered with some strands that had fallen free of his headband. A grin was on his face as he strolled in, showing off the normal canines and shiny white teeth. Seeing him, the old Hokage was struck with the memories of the past, where a young man that looked remarkably like this one stood, smiling and laughing at him. Gaping, he turned to Jiraiya, who was watching his astonishment with obvious amusement. The younger, though not by much, man just gave his older sensei a look that obviously said, "Told you it'd be good, didn't I?" before turning to the young man with his eyes and cuffing him sharply on the back of the head. "Itai!" the boy cried, dropping to the ground and clutching at his blonde head, dropping his eyes from Sarutobi. In an instant the boy was up, glaring and pointing an accusing finger at the white-haired Sannin. "You old pervert, what the hell was that for?" Jiraiya sent a glare of his own at the blonde and huffed lightly when he saw it went ignored and unnoticed. "What took you so long, Gaki?" The blonde boy huffed lightly and sat himself in a nearby chair, crossing his arms over his well-muscled chest. "I was looking around. It's been a long time since I've seen Konoha Ero Sennin." Sarutobi felt clarity come upon him when he heard the boy speak. The way this boy carried himself reminded the old Hokage so much of his successor, especially the shaggy blonde hair and cat-like blue eyes. There were hints of Kushina-chan in his face too. The high cheekbones, slightly arched eyebrows. With his looks and how old he was, this boy could most probably be Naruto. Sarutobi breathed out, pipe hanging from his fingertips, forgotten. The boy no Naruto turned to him with a small, genuine smile on his tanned face. "Hey Gigi-sama, long time no see ne?" Sarutobi felt stunned. This boy was the son of one of his most beloved friends and his lover, the woman he had cared for and respected the most in the village. Uzumaki Naruto had been like a grandson to him. He had been devastated and shocked when the news of his disappearance was reported by the frail owner of his apartment. He had spent months searching for the 6-year-old, sending every spare Anbu and hunter nin on wild goose chases to find him. He had finally given up years ago, when no one had seen or heard of the boy and no news of a blonde teenager that looked remarkably like Yondaime Hokage had ever reached their ears. And now he was here, standing in Sarutobi's office and giving him one of his unique fox-like grins. Sarutobi chuckled slightly, and soon the chuckles turned to full-blown laughter, causing his two guests to look at him in confusion. Wiping a stray tear from his eye, the old man sent a kind smile at the person who was like a grandson to him as he said, "Naruto-kun, you are always surprising me." The young blonde tipped his head in slight confusion before beaming at his surrogate grandfather, happiness at being with a treasured person evident on his face. Jiraiya watched the two happy men for a minute with a strange hint of softness in his dark eyes before rolling said eyes and planting another bop to the Gaki's forehead. He hid the smile that threatened to come over his face as said Gaki turned to glare up at him, blue eyes annoyed. Seeing his traveling companion just stand there, Naruto huffed and rolled his eyes before turning back to his Hokage. "Well, Gigi-sama, I suppose you want some questions answered, no?" Sarutobi nodded, his shock slowly fading away and clearing his mind. Subconsciously, he started to analyze Naruto's movements and speaking habits. He was quieter than before, but then again, the last time he had seen him was when he was 6 years old, and instead of having overly klutzy and slightly awkward movements, he had a quiet strength and skill, almost unnoticeable to anyone but the best shinobi. His mannerisms had toned down a bit, and his style of dress was that of a wandering samurai, loose, unassuming, but helpful to hiding weapons in the feet. Naruto, either not noticing the man's silent evaluation or ignoring it, started to talk. "Well, do you remember the day I went away?" When Sarutobi nodded, he added quietly, "It happened something like this. Flashback. Uzumaki Naruto, a kid of 6 years old, was currently pondering in a tree. Anyone who'd met the boy would instantly be shocked and deny Naruto doing any such thing. That boy? Think? Impossible. But the matter remains that Uzumaki Naruto was sitting in a tree, pondering the events that had overwhelmed his life in the last week. It had all started a few nights ago. He had been heading home, his mind happy and his stomach full from ramen, when he heard the shout. It didn't particularly bother him. A lot of people were shouting in the village. However, when another shout came, this one much closer to him, he felt fear pierce his heart. Those words, was it already that time of week? Get the demon kid. He turned, horrified and more than slightly scared, to see a huge mob of people running at him wearing cruel grins and those cold eyes. He instantly started to run, wondering why the hell he had forgotten to stay inside today, and quickly drawing up memories of the best escape routes to his apartment. None came to mind. The mob was quickly gaining in speed, and soon Naruto found himself in a small tucked-away alley, backed into a corner with more than 75 cold eyes watching his fear with malicious glee. They had waited so long for this moment. The weekly mob beatings they had issued weren't affecting the demon, but if they could just hit it hard enough, maybe it would die and they could live in peace. Two men started forward and held down the small child, ignoring his feeble thrashing and startled curses. Their partners sidled up next to the boy and gave dozens of clean, quick, and hard slaps to every part of the blonde's body. Seeing this, dozens more men and women came up, all trying to beat the most out of the demon child. Slaps and hard nudges soon turned into violent kicks and hard punches that sent the demon spawn into a whimpering ball, doing his best to protect himself and trying to keep his mind away from the torture being issued to him. Think of Ichiraku's, he told himself, keeping the friendly ramen stand firmly in mind. The mob was so high from the glee of finally extracting their revenge that they didn't notice the lazy man until last minute. And that was only after he stepped in between the boy and his captors and stared them down. The civilians instantly cowered, not used to such eyes being turned on them. After all, weren't the shinobi, for that was what this man was. His headband was visible on his shoulder. Of the village supposed to protect them? Why was he glaring at like they were scum on the edge of his sandals? They were doing a good deed. They were ridding the world of another demon. Once the villagers had back off, the man quickly bowed down near the blonde, no evident concern visible in his face. He gently picked up the boy, careful not to jostle the already healing wounds and make him wake up. Once the boy was settled easily into his arms, he sent a glare at the cowering mob before leaping away, heading towards the forest of death. He knew who this child was, the looks pointed towards the obvious, and he would be damned if he let those idiots beat this child to death. End flashback. Sarutobi felt rage come over him at the thought of an angry mob descending on his favorite blonde, but quickly squashed it, focusing on more important issues. Nobody from this mob had come forward and reported what they had seen, but Sarutobi wasn't really surprised by that. Naruto, he said quietly, this man, who was he exactly? The boy gave him an irritated glare. I'm getting to that Gigi-sama, be patient already. Sarutobi chuckled lightly and waved a hand, urging the boy to continue, and silently pondering the blonde's mysterious savior. Flashback. 2 hours later. Naruto woke up with a small groan, blurred images swimming around his head as soon as he opened his eyes. He wasn't moving, and he could tell that he was sitting on something rough, most likely tree bark. You're finally awake, brat, said a voice, and Naruto turned in alarm, instinctively turning up his arms to protect himself from any future blows. When none came, he peeped over the top of his arm, and stared at the stranger in front of him. His vision was finally clearing, and although the man's features were slightly blurred, he could make out most of his features pretty well. The guy was tall, handsome, with lazy golden eyes standing out in his thin tanned face. His hair was dark and straight, and pulled back into a tight ponytail at the base of the man's neck. His clothes were black and unassuming, and he had a Konoha headband tied around his left forearm. Who are you? Why did you bring me here? Naruto asked, his voice trembling slightly as he tried to find his way to his feet. If this guy came out here to kill him, he wouldn't go down on his butt. The man's irritation seemed to vanish and was replaced by a lazily amused attitude. My name's Raiden, kid, and I brought you here to talk. Raiden watched with amusement and slight surprise as the kid's terror practically disappeared and was replaced with an analytical look that he had never seen on such a young brat's face. Serious blue eyes were staring at him, and had he been a lesser man he might have fidgeted. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the cunning disappeared, leaving a smiling and hyper-blonde boy behind. "What did ya want to talk about, Oni-san?" the boy asked, bouncing over to him. Raiden raised an eyebrow lazily, hiding his surprise that the boy had recovered so quickly from the numerous injuries he had received from the mob beating. Only 2 hours later, and he was already bouncing around like it was nothing. There was no sign of mental trauma either, or any tears. He sighed as he realized that Minato's plans for Naruto to be a hero must not have worked at all if the brat was used to mob beatings. He decided to get straight to the point. "Boy," he said slowly, "do you have anything in this village that ties you to it?" Naruto stopped mid-bounce and gave the man a shocked look. Raiden motioned impatiently for him to answer, so the little blonde considered the question before answering. "Well, Gigi-sama is nice to me, getting ramen for me all the time and paying for my apartment, but people are always insulting him for helping me. I am a burden to him." He stopped for a minute and then looked up at Raiden. "So, no, I guess." Raiden nodded and said, "Would you like to leave the village with me?" Blink, blink, nani? Raiden grimaced and rubbed one of his ears. The boy yelled too loud, "Damn it." Just like that baka best friend of his. Of course Kushina had been loud too. He shook away the memories and looked down at the boy irritably. "I'd like you to travel with me," he said through gritted teeth, his golden eyes annoyed. The boy flinched and Raiden's temper vanished. He had forgotten that Naruto had, more than likely, gotten beaten weekly or even daily. If that show today was any indication, the boy hadn't fought back, had let them hurt him, and had taken their insults, and showing anger in front of him was probably not the best way to earn his trust. He sighed. Damn it, getting this boy to trust him was going to require work, and he would need the boy's trust if he was going to get the brat to travel with him. Raiden nearly whined. He hated work in all shapes, sizes, and forms. It nearly made him wonder if offering this opportunity to the brat was worth all the effort. He stared down at the blonde head and sighed. Even if he had wanted to, he knew that giving the kid up now was not an option. Naruto would be stifled in this village. His talent, which was so obvious to Raiden, would be ignored by the prejudiced teachers of the academy. He couldn't allow that to happen to Minato's son, and he was already regretting not coming back to the village earlier. Naruto stared at the ground, contemplating the fact that this strange man with unique eyes had saved him just so that they could travel together. However, even in his hyper 6-year-old mind, the little blonde realized that something was very wrong with this picture. Hesitantly he looked up, hoping that Rai-ni-san wouldn't be angry at him anymore. He blinked as he came face to face with soft gold eyes. The man ruffled his hair softly and then stepped back, his lazy attitude once again flashing across his face. "Well," Naruto thought stupidly, "I guess he's not mad anymore." "Why, me?" the boy asked, staring up at the man's face. Raiden seemed to consider it for a bit and he decided there was no use lying to the kid. "Your father and mother were good friends of mine, and I don't want anything bad to happen to their kid. Plus you have talent, and if I get an apprentice, then maybe Hisoka will stop nagging at me." Naruto's eyes widened when he heard that this man had known his parents, beamed when Rai-ni-san said he had talent, and then said, "I'll go with you." End flashback. Sarutobi stared at the boy, his eyes wide with shock. "Did you say Raiden?" he asked, completely bewildered. Tanaka Raiden was one of his best Junin, but he was lazy as hell and often away on long-term assignments. The only people Sarutobi had ever seen the man associate with were Uchiha Itachi, Hitaki Kakashi, and his weird wandering samurai friend Ryu Hisoka. He had also been Yondaimi's personal bodyguard and best friend. He chuckled slightly. Now he knew who the mysterious apprentice was that Raiden had been bragging about for the last 8 years. Though it seems strange that Raiden had never taken the time to tell Sarutobi he'd had Naruto all this time. He would have to ask him about that. "Oh, and by the way, old man." Sarutobi shrunk in his seat as he was distinctly reminded of Kushina. "Did you ever think to tell me about my parents?" Sarutobi resisted the urge to fidget in his seat. Naruto's stern gaze reminded him way too much of his. It was both stunning and ironic how much the village demon looked like his father. Minato had always managed to make Sarutobi feel like a child who had messed up when he was angry or stern. It was a gift that very few people knew about. Sarutobi had managed that. He didn't want people to know that Minato could give a good tongue thrashing to his elder and get away without punishment. I didn't wish for you to be targeted by your father's enemies, Sarutobi explained gently, ignoring Jiraiya who was looking increasingly confused. I couldn't trust you to keep it to yourself if someone provoked you badly enough. Naruto's eyes softened slightly and he sighed. I grew up much faster than the rest of the children here, Jiji-sama, he explained quietly, and my dearest wish was to know who my parents were. I'm angry that you took that away from me, but I can understand why. Sarutobi-sensei. Jiraiya cut in as the two men looked at each other silently. What are you two going on about? Sarutobi turned to his student with a look of astonishment on his face. You're telling me you took this boy here without knowing who he was? The Sannin shrugged nonchalantly. I knew he was the brat you had been moaning about for the last few years, and I was heading this way anyway, so I decided to escort him. But what are you two talking about with his parents? Sarutobi and Naruto looked at each other, silently having a conversation about whether to reveal this information to Jiraiya or not. When Naruto nodded, Sarutobi waved a hand for him to explain it to the Toad Sannin. My father was Namikaze Minato, also known as Yondaime Hokage, Naruto said quietly, and my mother was his private lover, Uzumaki Kushina, a foreign shinobi from the former Uzu no Kuni. Jiraiya's jaw dropped and he openly gaped at the boy. What the hell is this boy implying? He thought, his shock quickly being replaced with anger and righteous disbelief. Boy, I don't know who the hell you think you are, but there's no way you're Minato's son. He was good friends with Uzumaki Kushina, sure, but he would have told me if she was pregnant, or someone would have noticed it. How dare you? He stopped when he caught sight of Naruto's glare, arrow Sennin. My name is Uzumaki Naruto, and my mother is Uzumaki Kushina. I have no idea why Two-san kept their relationship secret, especially from his friends and family, but he is my father. Jiraiya stared at him for a moment, swallowing in the fact that this boy who he had taken an interest in, so much like his previous student, it was startling. Now he knew why, for the past couple of weeks was claiming to be the son of his only apprentice and his previously unknown lover. Then he glared, his fury and frustration mounting. Why would Minato keep it from him if he had a lover, especially Kushina? I took a blood test, Naruto's voice interrupted the Sannin's thoughts, making Jiraiya turn to him in disbelief. I had a medic look at it, and I looked at it myself. It states clearly that my parents were Namikaze Minato and Uzumaki Kushina. Sarutobi was the one gaping in belief this time. He knew of blood tests. Orphans all over the countries took them to determine who their parents were and if they had any living family left to contact. It took a skilled medic nin to do the jutsu, however, and he was curious who had done it for Naruto. Jiraiya held out his hand, and Naruto sighed slightly before taking out one of the scrolls that were hanging around his waist. He tossed it over to Jiraiya, who caught it and immediately pried it open, eyes quickly scanning the contents. The old man gasped and the scroll fell from his limp hands. In big, loopy letters it stated, Uzumaki Naruto, father. Namikaze Minato. Deceased at age 25. Mother. Uzumaki Kushina, deceased at age 27. There was a complete family tree of both the Namikazes and Uzumakis below both Naruto's parents' names. You, sweet Kami? Jiraiya stuttered, at a complete loss for words. If anything was known about blood tests, it was that if they were completed they were completely accurate and impossible to forge or change in any way. And, that meant? There was something left of the student he had loved and lost. Jiraiya passed a weary hand over his face before glaring half-heartedly at the blonde brat through his fingers. And you didn't tell me this when we first met because... Naruto's face was the perfect mask of innocence. If it was not for the small twinkle in his eyes, people would completely believe it, as he pouted at his companion, because you never asked? Even when it was hidden behind his rather large hand, anyone could see Jiraiya's temple throb with annoyance. Slowly, he lifted his hand away from his face and sent an irritated glare at a certain innocent-looking blonde. Stalking over to said boy, he glared down at him before calmly and firmly giving him a hard bop to the head. Naruto went down like a rock. Itai, why is always me? The young boy wailed, clutching at the bump on his head while sprawled over the floor. Sarutobi watched the two in amusement and with a hint of tenderness. It was good to see Jiraiya behave like he had 14 years ago, before Minato's death. The few times he had met with him after the Kyuubi attack, the Sannin had been cold, precise, and businesslike. The complete opposite of his usual informal, humorous reports. He stifled a laugh as he watched Naruto climb back to his feet and enter a glaring contest with his former student. Both of the younger men were making numerous faces at each other. If it wasn't for his reputation as the Hokage, Sarutobi might have dropped to the floor and started laughing his butt off. He let it continue for a while, drawing amusement from their childish play, before he cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence. They both reluctantly drew out of the fight, eyes promising that sooner or later they would have a rematch. So sorry, excuse me. I must be getting some sort of cough. Sarutobi grinned when Naruto rolled his eyes, obviously not drawn in by his fib. More importantly, Naruto, why are you here now, and where is Raiden? Rai-ni-san said to go without him. He'll probably be here later, maybe in 3 days or so. Anyhow, the reason I came back was to ask if I could join the Genin exams this year to become a Konoha shinobi. Sarutobi rolled the idea over in his head. On one hand, Iruka had been saying that they needed another graduate for this year's batch of Genins as they were just one short. Naruto had been at least partially trained by Raiden, hopefully, so he might be able to qualify. However, there was also the risk of ruining the team setups now with a wildcard graduate, and the risk of Naruto's identity as a Hokage's son being discovered. Chewing on the base of his pipe, Sarutobi thought about it a few minutes more and then giving a shrug. What the hell? Why not let the brat try out? All right Naruto, I'll write an explanation to Iruka-kun about your arrival. You're lucky. The Genin exams are today and they don't start until noon. You'll have quite a bit of time to get reacquainted with the village. He peered out of his large windows and winced when he saw the still dark skies of Konoha. Kami-sama, is it that early? Ah, Sarutobi-sensei, I was wondering about that, Jiraiya interrupted. Is this Gaki going to be put with 12-year-olds? No matter how bad he is, he'd outstrip the shrimps by miles by physical training. Sarutobi smiled wearily. Since we are living in a time of peace, Jiraiya, the council has decided that academy training will be longer. The students now wait until they are 14 to graduate. This year's graduates are the second to take this extended route. The Sannin stilled at that before sputtering in outrage. That's ridiculous. To wait so long before giving the kiddies proper training is suicidal. By the time they're 14 they could be Chunins or even Junins, instead of just graduating. What the hell is that idiotic council thinking? They are thinking that this is peace and war is a far-off time. They apparently want to keep the children as innocent as possible for as long as they can, Sarutobi stated sadly, puffing on his pipe. How stupid. Both men turned to look at Naruto, whose eyes were suddenly cold. Those children chose to be ninja, not some school kids playing at a dangerous job. If they don't get the seriousness of this duty into their heads at an early age, none of them will live past their 20s. Your supposedly kind council is just signing their death wishes. Sarutobi sighed slightly. It hadn't taken him long to see the reasoning of such a way of thinking, but the Hokage couldn't pull an order from the council if the majority voted in it. It was one of the lesser quirks, ones that included paperwork, of being who he was. It surprised him, however, at how quickly Naruto had seen the dangers of the council's actions, and how cold his tone and eyes were. Quickly he sent a questioning look at Jiraiya, but the man just shook his head, obviously puzzled. Sarutobi eyed the bowed blonde head before him while thinking, did something happen to him while he was with Raiden? Well, anyways, please enjoy yourselves. Naruto, you'll have to report to classroom 5 at noon. Give this to the brown-haired man there, Sarutobi instructed, giving Naruto a slip of paper. His name is Amino Iruka-kun, and he is the sensei of the class. Naruto nodded and accepted the slip of paper, slipping it into one of the pouches at his waist. I'll be sure to do that, Jiji-sama. Ready to go, Ero Sennin, or do you need to give that info to him first? The boy asked, turning to the white-haired man. Jiraiya smiled slightly and shook his head. I need to get some sleep before I report in. I feel sorry for that mentor of yours, he groused. Having an apprentice that wakes up so early in the morning must be such a pain for a lazy man. Ignoring the sputtering of his companion, the Sannin turned to his ex-sensei and raised an eyebrow. Sarutobi-sensei, I'll report back after noon. Is that alright with you? Sarutobi nodded and waved a hand at them in obvious dismissal. He watched with a smile as the two left the room, bickering and bantering the entire way out. Silently the old man rose to his feet and turned to stare out his wide windows, thinking heavily about the new developments that had occurred in the last hour. But there was one thing he knew for certain. This village would no longer be boring, with Uzumaki Naruto among them. We're not lost. We're locationally challenged. John M. Ford. Naruto bounced as he walked, enjoying the feeling of not having to watch his back every second because people were coming after him. For some reason everyone always happened to be after him. Naruto had said it was because of his charm. Rai Ni-san had said it was because no one could stand his idiocy and wanted to kill him as soon possible. So he had learned early on to watch his back. But in this village there were already people watching the streets, not that he'd rely on them. After all, Naruto knew how easy it was to sneak in and out of the village firsthand, so he could release some of the caution that had been installed in his brain since he was born. It was around 9 o'clock now, and Ero Sennin had left to go gather his research. Note. Look and drool at pretty girls at the onsen like the pervert he is. So that left Naruto with time to waste and nothing to do. So he had decided to go shopping. Now no self-respecting man would admit to wanting to shop, and Naruto was one of the manliest men anyone could have ever met. Or so he told himself, but he needed some new clothes. Not that his hakama and haori were too bad to wear, but they were smelly and worn and pretty much the only clothes he had. Plus, the wide legs of his hakama, while being great for a traveling samurai, were useless for a ninja. He'd need something sleeker and much easier to travel in, especially in the forests that Fire Country seemed to favor. So, since he was in a ninja village, he decided to go shopping for clothes. Which led to his current dilemma. Where exactly were the clothing shops around here? Naruto could see plenty for civilians. There were almost too many, actually, but none seemed to hold any shinobi clothes or the fighting accessories that they'd need. Of course, the blonde teenager could see the wisdom of hiding their shops. Disguised enemies could easily enter them and find out all they wanted to know about Konoha equipment. But shouldn't the ninja of the village be able to find them? Annoyed, Naruto continued to search. Civilian store, kids store, flower shop. How many shops do they have around here? He thought after a few hours of wandering around mindlessly. Left eye twitching, he carefully drew in a few deep breaths, trying to keep himself from blowing up everything he could see. After all, that wouldn't be a very good way of reintroducing himself to the village now, would it? Naruto sighed and turned to a small shore advertising 10% off all goods inside. He, like his mentor, was very cheap and wanted to spend as little money as possible. Since he couldn't find any shinobi stores, he'd ask for directions or deal with civilian clothes until Raiden got off his lazy ass to show him around. Naruto entered the small shop, blinked when he saw that most of the clothes were gone. Sighing, he walked up to the counter and rang the small silver bell, waiting for an employee to come out to help him. A young man with dark hair and brown eyes came in from the back of the shop and greeted Naruto with a friendly smile. "What can I do for you today, Samurai-san?" Naruto blinked and looked down at himself, wondering if he really looked like a samurai. Mentally shrugging, he answered, "I'm new here and I was wondering if you could point me in the direction of a store with shinobi clothing. I'm afraid these just won't cut it," he added, picking at his white haori. The man smiled slightly and said, "Well, you seem to have a lot of luck, sir, as this is a store for ninja folk." The manager put up a few civilian clothes up in the front and the back. He pointed to the door he had come out of. "Has any and all shinobi clothing you could want. Would you follow me, sir?" Naruto nodded, happy that he seemed to have found his place and wouldn't need to wander all over town anymore. He followed the employee to the back and gaped at the huge room that was filled with all types and colors of sturdy, ninja clothes. He grinned at the employee and waved him off before wandering into the racks of clothes and searching for his new outfit. He really wasn't that picky when it came to clothes, and the only thing he required was something darker colored. He grabbed a pile of cargo pants that had tons of pockets, both visible and hidden, and went down to his feet, in all sorts of dark colors, especially dark gray and green, which were good for missions in Konoha. He also spotted some sleeveless, skin-tight shirts and grabbed a handful, testing out the fabric. They stretched easily and Naruto grinned, grabbing a few more. Naruto headed over the coat section, dragging his already large pile of clothes behind him and intently searched for styles. He grinned when he saw one that he liked and quickly tried it on. It buttoned down to his waist with small-ish buttons and was left to flare about his legs. Its hems reached to a little below his knees, and the sleeves were so long they covered all but the tips of his fingers. Nodding, he shrugged off the one he had tried on and grabbed a couple more in the same style, only with different colors. One was white on the outside and black inside, for easy switching, a fading gray, and a deep forest green. The last he picked out was a dark crimson red that he would wear when he wasn't on missions. He headed to the shoe section and scrunched his nose at the collection of shinobi sandals the store seemed to have. He had never liked those shoes, they seemed too uncomfortable to him. Naruto quickly hunted through the aisles and grinned when he came across a small section of combat boots. He grabbed 2 pairs of black leather knee-length boots that were tied onto the side by square silver buckles. He was delighted to find that they had a catch for a dagger in the heel and a hidden slot for a knife or kunai to slide into on the side. Finally he grabbed some cream and white bandages, he had been running out, and a variety of bandanas to cover his bright hair. He also spotted some elbow-length, steel-backed fingerless gloves that he instantly liked and brought to his pile on the spot. Satisfied, he stared down at his large pile, and was glad that he had saved up a lot of money over the years. This was going to cost him a lot. The cashier looked surprised at Naruto's large bundle when he brought it to the desk, and even more surprised when the blonde even had enough money for the entire thing. Quickly Naruto asked about a weapons shop and, after getting directions to one, left the store, 2 huge bags slung over his shoulder. He hurriedly made his way to the hotel room Jiraiya had rented for them when the hotels had opened and shucked his samurai clothing, bundling it into a ball and throwing it in the corner of the room. Hurriedly he changed into his black cargo pants and shirt, pulling his dark red trench coat, black gloves, boots, and a black bandana on as well. He secured a kunai pouch to his left thigh and his sword against his back before quickly making his way out of the apartment. He would have to run for it. It was nearly noon and he still had no idea where the academy was. Good instincts usually tell you what to do long before your head has figured it out. Michael Burke, Yamanaka Ino was not having a good day. First of all, her favorite purple outfit was dirty, which meant she had to wear the less seductive black outfit that she only wore during training. Added to the fact that she had somehow managed to meet up with Forehead-chan, and was currently getting hot, dirty, and dusty while participating in the silently challenged foot race, and the blonde was starting to curse the fact that she even got out of bed. It very nearly made her want to cry, in fact. Today was her genin exam, one of the most important days in her entire teenaged life. She was supposed to be glowing, to be sparkling, to be wearing purple. Not getting dust and grime over her already second-rate black dress in a stupid foot race with Haruno Sakura. Growling under her breath, Ino shoved at her pink-haired partner viciously, smiling when she heard the slight wheeze of pain. She knew it was wrong to take out her anger on Sakura, but right now she was hot, dirty, and tired, so she just didn't care. She nearly collapsed in relief when the academy came into her sight. Shade, shade, sweet, sweet shade, she thought giddily, speeding up even more in her hurry to get to the wonderful shade of her school. Shit! A call came from her right, making Ino's head turn sharply to the left. Her eyes widened in horror as she saw a red and black blur coming at her, too fast to dodge. Watch out, lady. Too late, Ino realized she had to get out of the way. By the time she had started to move, the bundle had already crashed into her, sending both of them tumbling to the ground in a heap of tangled arms and legs. She squeezed her eyes shut tightly, blocking out the pain in her back as she had been taught to do, before carefully cracking an eye open to see her assailant. Letting out a groan as she saw nothing but red, black, and blonde, Ino carefully squirmed underneath the person, signaling them to get off of her. The person seemed to get it, and carefully they got up, muttering, shit, shit, shitty shit, 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 under their breath. Relieved to be able to breathe again, that person was heavy. Ino scrambled to her feet and dusted herself off, wincing at the new tears and marks on her dress. She glared at the currently unharmed Sakura. Of course the pinky would be unharmed, because nothing ever seemed to happen to poor little Sakura. Her ire rising dangerously, Ino turned to where she still felt the presence of her perpetrator, ready to give them a sound piece of her mind for squashing her like that. And then she blinked. She had been expecting a guy in his older teens or adulthood, a civilian maybe, or an extremely clumsy shinobi to have knocked into her. Not a guy who looked to be around her age, with shaggy blonde hair falling out of his black bandana, a long dark red trench coat and baggy black cargo pants. At least she had been right on one part. The katana on the guy's back and the kunai bag around his thigh pointedly told of his shinobi training. The guy rubbed the back of his neck in a nervous gesture, grinning at her with a slanted-eyed smile that reminded Ino oddly of a fox before saying, "Gomen." I was hurrying and lost in thought, so I suppose I wasn't really watching where I was going. You're not hurt, are you? At the last question the boy opened his eyes to reveal deep blue irises. Ino shook her head silently, still slightly shocked that she had been knocked down by a boy who could probably rival Sasuke and Shikamaru in. Ah, alright then. The boy looked her up and down before nodding to himself reassuringly, as if to convince himself thoroughly that she was unharmed. He perked up as he took in her ninja attire and asked quickly, "Are you a shinobi?" Ino shrugged modestly, "Not technically, I suppose. I'm still in the academy, although I'm taking the genin exams today." "Do you think you could show me the way to the academy?" the boy asked. "I'm new in Konoha," and Ero Sennin disappeared before giving me directions. Ino could see the pout starting to form on the boy's face, as well as the widening of the deep blue eyes that were starting to film over with unshed tears. She nearly groaned. She recognized this. She used the ultimate puppy dog eye no jutsu every time she wanted to buy something and needed money from her parents. Groaning, Ino nodded at the boy, getting a large, beaming smile in return. The boy's kicked puppy look has disappeared, leaving him looking hyper and happy. "Yata. I told Ero Sennin someone would show me the way there. Stupid old pervert, saying everyone would avoid me because of my stupidity." He muttered the last bit under his breath, making Ino sweat drop. "Anyhow, my name is Uzumaki Naruto. I'm Yamanaka Ino," she replied, smiling a bit at him, "and this forehead with a body is Haruno Sakura." Naruto spared her a glance, blue eyes narrowing with both confusion and annoyance as he saw the pink-haired girl's glare. Ino gave Sakura a curious look. Why was she looking at Naruto like she was the dust on the edge of her sandals? They had just met, and he hadn't done anything bad, just accidentally knocked into Ino. And Sakura wasn't close enough to her to be upset about that. "And why would you need to go to academy?" Sakura asked icily, sticking her nose into the air haughtily. Ino gaped at her snobbishness before turning to Naruto, fully intending to apologize for her rival's behavior. She stopped dead when she was met with narrow, cold blue eyes, even though they weren't directed at her. Even an Uchiha's glare wasn't that deadly, and that was saying something. "Because I'm gonna take the genin exam today, Haruno," he replied tightly, and then noticeably reined control over his death glare, giving a falsely easy smile. Sakura looked surprised, then annoyed, and then smug. "You're lying. You can't take the genin exam. You need to actually train in the academy first." Naruto scoffed at her, making Sakura glare at him with angry green eyes. "I suppose you read that somewhere in a book, Haruno? It doesn't matter where the person's gotten the training, so long as they've got it. Just because I haven't trained in your precious academy doesn't mean you're a better ninja than me." Ino suddenly had a moment of insight. Sakura was treating Naruto this way because she thought he was some vagabond ninja and hadn't gotten a proper shinobi training? Was she really that shallow? Some part of Ino acknowledged that her ex-friend could easily be that shallow, given the chance. But it seemed strange that she would instantly dislike Naruto because he hadn't gone to the academy with them, yet was taking the genin exam anyway. "But can we please go now? I don't know about you ladies, but I'm not particularly fond of being late for important exams." Naruto's voice pulled Ino out of her musings. She looked up to see Sakura glancing at him with her haughty air back up, but the pink-haired girl nodded, before rushing down the street, leaving them behind in the dust. Ino scowled. How perfectly Sakura. When she glanced at her fellow blonde, she noticed Naruto was staring at the disappearing back of Sakura thoughtfully, frowning slightly. When he noticed eyes upon him, he turned to her and smiled. "Shall we go then?" he asked, gesturing in the direction Sakura had hurried off in. Ino nodded hesitantly and started to walk down the path, Naruto at her side. Slowly she put the shinobi aspects of her personality to use and started to analyze the conversation she had just been a part of. Sakura had been unusually bitchy to Naruto, But then, she had discovered a possible reason for that a few minutes earlier. It didn't really explain why she hated him at first sight, but it did explain why her snobbishness escalated in Naruto's presence. This Naruto character, on the other hand, she didn't know what to make of him. He didn't seem to get along with Sakura, which made him okay in her books, but he was stranger with no past nonetheless. "Ino-chan?" Naruto's voice once again pulled her out of her musings. "You alright?" She blinked, and then realized she must have zoned out for a few minutes while she had been thinking. "Yeah," she managed to say, laughing dryly. "I think I'm just nervous for the exam." "Don't be," Naruto told her quietly, turning to give her a sly-looking smile that made her slightly suspicious. "These tests aren't that hard." Trained as she was, Ino had noticed the stress on the word, "these," as well as the look Naruto had given her with the last sentence. Was he trying to tell her something? What exactly? What did he mean these tests weren't that hard? Was there more than one test? Another one after the exam maybe? With questions racing through her brain at light speed, Ino didn't notice they had walked inside the academy until Naruto gave her a light shove from behind. Shaking her head and heading for Iruka-sensei's classroom, she stored her thoughts and questions deep into her mind for later examination. After all, she couldn't be distracted during the exam. The first impression is an important thing. Nobody ever forgets it, even after the second, third, and fourth impressions. Unknown. Naruto chuckled under her breath as he watched Ino square her shoulders and thrust out her chin defiantly, looking like the stubborn woman he knew she was. He knew it wasn't that great of an idea to give out hints about the team tests right before the exam, when Ino was already nervous, but he wasn't sure if he would be able to see her later. She was nice, and he could see good emotions rolling off of her when she talked, telling of her innocent intentions. Her aura was a mixture of willpower, determination, and strength of heart, showing good Kunoichi material. If anything, Ino was friendship material, and he wouldn't allow anyone close to becoming his friend fail the team exam because they were surprised by it. Rules about keeping the information to himself never meant anything to him. Naruto made a habit to break as many rules as possible. He followed his female companion quietly, trying to quell his nervousness. He was good with people, especially those around his own age, but he was going to see some of his playmates that weren't, and it was something he hadn't been really looking forward to. He'd already met two of them, and it had quickly turned into a disaster. He had recognized Ino right away. He hadn't actively bothered her out to play. Girls were still icky back then, but she had rampaged into him one day and demanded he play a game of the ninja and the princesses with her. Not being one to refuse company, even if it did come in the form of a bossy 5-year-old girl, he had accepted, becoming a ninja to rescue Princess Ino from where she had been kidnapped. He'd had fun with her until her parents had discovered them playing and taken her away. He didn't play with Ino again after that. But Sakura, Naruto frowned as he delved into his memory. Sakura had been a sweet-tempered, mild little girl until she had reached her 5th birthday and met Ino, who had given her confidence. She had ignored him before that, but during his last year at Konoha, she'd been a bitch, to put it bluntly. And with her current attitude at him, Naruto was willing to bet that hadn't changed. But her soul was myriad of soft, healing colors and fiery spirit. She'd be one hell of a woman when she got off of her high horse and learned that being a shinobi was serious job, not just book smarts. Her brain might be a help before the battle, but in the war field, she'd need serious training before she could hope to come out alive. Training she obviously didn't have, if her power level was anything to go by. Naruto was startled out of his musings when he bumped into Ino's back. Peering around the girl, he saw a sign hanging over the door they were standing in front of saying, Classroom 5. Obviously, they had arrived. Ignoring Ino's sudden nervousness, he gestured at her to open the door. Her irritation flaring at him made him smile, but she did as he asked, hesitantly opening the door and stepping inside. Naruto followed quietly. Damn, the place was loud. He was startled to notice the muddle of screaming banshees, that other people would see as human teenage girls, were clawing at each other, doing their best to tear each other's throats out. Naruto shuddered lightly, reminding himself to avoid these girls for all eternity. Their bloodlust was really unnerving. He eyed the mob carefully as he slipped around them and slid into one of the few empty seats open, oblivious to the fact that he had just taken the very thing the bunch girls were screaming at each other for. The chair next to Uchiha Sasuke. Said boy was currently wondering if this kid was stupid, had a death wish, or was possibly insane. Everyone who attended Classroom 5 with Uchiha Sasuke, especially the boys, knew the rules and followed them religiously. They were as follows. 1. Never deal with USRFA, Uchiha Sasuke's rabid fan association, or get between them and Sasuke. This will mean instant, painful death. 2. Never take the seat next to Uchiha Sasuke if you value your life, sanity, ears, or precious body items in general. Not only had this blonde dope, who was he anyways, broken the second rule, he'd also shattered the first one as well. Smirking lightly, Sasuke leaned back in his chair and waited for the USRFA to notice the intrusion. Naruto, on the other hand, was studying the boy next to him out of the corner of his eye with a curious and slightly wary look. His hair was black, almost darker than Rai-ni-san's, and his eyes seemed to blend into his pupils. The hairstyle was little unusual, and oddly reminded him of a duck's butt. Struggling to hold in the laughter that image provided, Naruto roved his eyes down the boy's body, nodding to himself when he noticed well-toned muscles and hidden weapons. At least one of the kiddies in here was actually taking this job seriously. The boy's clothes were fairly basic, black, unrestricting, and bland, standard Junin wear actually. He raised an eyebrow at the only extravagant clothing the boy wore, a long, sleeveless black coat that fell to the middle of the boy's calves. 1. What was with there being the word, Avenger, stenciled into the back in bright crimson red? But wait, Naruto peered closer. Was that an Uchiha symbol above it? Naruto silently sighed to himself. Of course it would be his luck to sit next to the only Uchiha in the room. Then an idea came onto him and his eyebrow propped up as he considered the mob of screaming banshees. Slowly understanding dawned on his face and he turned to face the front slowly. That poor boy. The banshees probably did this every day. Sasuke noticed the new guys staring in sudden revelation that the screaming girls were his fangirls. He cringed. He hated how that sounded. And most likely realized that they wanted the seat the blonde was sitting in. He smirked outwardly, while inwardly pleading for the stupid, mentally insane boy to not leave him alone. The fangirls would jump him as soon as he was by himself again. Naruto grinned when he caught a wave of desperation in the Uchiha's aura. He knew how the boy felt. He'd been chased by fangirls a couple of times when traveling with Rai-ni-san, who'd found it uproariously funny, the bastard, and they had scared the crap out of him with their aggressive chasing. So instead of doing what a normal person would do in this situation, note, running to the hills in terror, he tipped his chair back casually and plastered a completely bored look onto his face. He smiled when he felt relief flare in Uchiha's aura. Looking from under his lashes, he considered the boy's glow, wondering about a few things in it. Naruto had had the ability to see auras for as long as he could remember, reading the colors around people, their aura, so to speak. He had studied the 4 levels: core, physical, mental, emotional, and power level, so much that he knew them for memory now, and could easily read them like a book. It wasn't mind reading, he was reading the emotions and the intentions of the person he was looking at, their personality, so to speak. The 4 levels of a soul were fairly simple. The core would be with them until they died, only changing during major life events that affected the person's entire way of thinking, i.e. a loved one's death, betrayal by everyone you love, etc. It was a ball of glowing energy, often with a variety of colors that sat just at the bottom of the ribcage. The physical level was a small, glowy aura around the core, only changing when the physical conditions did. The mental, emotional level was constantly changing, and spread around the core and physical level for 1.5 meters or so. It shifted with every mood, spouted every intention clearly, mostly in the form of colors. And finally, the power level told of a person's power in the ninja arts. The lighter they were, the more skilled. This one surrounded the person's entire body. Rai-ni-san had said that seeing auras was something like an Uzumaki bloodline. Most Uzumakis had been trackers with it. They could remember every aura they had seen and easily find it within a decent distance. A person also couldn't mask their aura, which made it easy for an Uzumaki to find them even if they were suppressing their chakra or hiding under a genjutsu. Since it was a bloodline from Uzu no Kuni, his mother's homeland, which was now deserted and forgotten, not many people knew about it. Naruto frowned as he stared at the Uchiha's aura, noticed the dark, heavy black-red cloud hanging over the previously royal blue, white, and purple core. Black symbolized death, darkness, and vengeance most of the time, and that heavy color of dried blood was a color normally seen for those out for revenge. That would explain the whole Avenger thing, Naruto thought thoughtfully. He was thrown out of his thoughts when the person next to him cleared his throat quietly, before shaking his head and smiling, holding out a hand. Uzumaki Naruto. Nice fangirls you have there, Uchiha, he said. Sasuke stared at the offered hand before taking it and giving a soft shake and quickly letting go. He took in Naruto's tied-back blonde hair, bright blue eyes, whisker marks, and red trench coat with thoughtful eyes. HN Uzumaki, he answered, turning back to face the front, although he continued to study Naruto out of the corner of his eye. Uchiha Sasuke. Naruto noticed the curious appraisal and grinned lightly. He remembered hearing something about an Uchiha Sasuke from Rai-ni-san and Itachi-sensei, though. Didn't Itachi-sensei say Sasuke was his little brother? He wondered at that. While the two looked a lot alike, their difference in skill was obvious, even if he wasn't able to see auras. Itachi-sensei's power level was a white-yellow color, so light it looked like pure white, while Sasuke's was a darker silvery gray. It didn't really make sense that this guy would be so much weaker than his older brother. Didn't Itachi-sensei train him? Sighing, he decided to find out where the Uchiha estates were in Konoha so he could visit the older Uchiha and find out all the facts for himself. That decided, Naruto returned from his thoughts only to find a medium wave of killer intent focused at him. Slowly he turned around and winced. So the banshees had finally noticed. Instead of trying to kill each other like they had been doing previously, the mob stood together in a huddle, arms crossed and death glares fixed on their faces. Inwardly laughing at how possessive these girls were, he raised an eyebrow, making even more killer intent appear. The boys of Classroom 5, who had noticed the confrontation, were impressed with the blonde's show of bravery. Most people would have wet their pants at the looks those girls were giving off. When the girls neither said anything nor stopped glaring, Naruto sighed and snapped, "What?" Screaming Banshee number 1, Haruno Sakura, stepped forward as the spokesperson for USRFA. "Get out of that seat, Baka. Can't you see Sasuke-kun doesn't want to sit next to you, and would rather have one of us with him instead?" She gestured at the huddle behind her. With a mischievous look on his face that gave many of the USRFA some second thoughts about the confrontation, Naruto turned to Sasuke and asked, "Yoteme." Many of the girls twitched at the disrespectful name. "Would you rather have me, or one of the herd of screaming banshees sit here?" Sasuke raised an eyebrow and Naruto grinned as a tint of amused yellow floated over the Uchiha's aura. He gestured at Naruto saying, "You'll suffice, Dobi. I think I'll need my ears by the end of today." A few of the girls, including Sakura and Ino, who stood behind her ex-best friend, sputtered at the last comment. Naruto nodded, mockingly serious, before turning back to the huddle with a smug, fox-like smirk on his face. "Well, you heard him, ladies. I wish you luck on finding the other available seats in the room." Then Naruto turned back to the front, ignoring the disgruntled murmuring and angry stares of the rapidly disappearing mob. Sasuke's respect for the blonde jumped a bit. He knew how hard it was to remain aloof and nonchalant with those kinds of stares boring into the back of your head. Eventually all of the banshees were gone, except for the numero uno, who slid into the empty seat on the right of Naruto, glaring at the blonde as she did so. But before the pinky could extract her revenge, the door opened to reveal what could only be their missing teacher. Naruto eyed him with interest. So this was Amino Iruka-kun? With the plain dark topknot and brown eyes, the man didn't stand out that much. The only unusual thing about him was the thick scar covering the bridge of his nose. But Naruto was on his guard all the same. This man's power level was colored a delicate light blue, which meant he was more powerful than his station as a teacher implied. Quickly and gracefully Naruto slipped out of his seat, sending a look towards Sasuke that said plainly, "Save my seat if you value your ears at all." Shuddering slight Sasuke agreed with a nod and sent a glare towards Sakura, who had been getting up to move with a smile on her face. She instantly froze, smile slipping, before sinking back into her chair. Meanwhile, Naruto made his way to the front of the room, heading for Iruka. The teacher was watching him with curious and slightly wary eyes, but he kept his friendly and open smile on his face. Naruto drew to a halt in front of him, and without saying a word handed the man Sandame's note. Iruka eyed the new kid carefully before inwardly shrugging and taking the small slip of paper. He quickly unfolded and scanned the scribbled words. Iruka-kun, the boy is Uzumaki Naruto. He has recently returned from a training trip, but I believe he is capable, so allow him to take the genin exams. Please be open-minded. Sarutobi Sandame Hokage. Naruto watched warily as Iruka's face turned white then red and his aura flashed with fury. A sad sort of understanding came on him as angry brown eyes met his own. Iruka was one of them. One of the people who hated him because of Kyuubi. Oh yes, he knew about his residential demon. He had known for years, ever since he had been knocked out for training too long and too hard, and Kyuubi had drawn him down into the dark sewer chamber in Naruto's mind. They had talked regularly since then, connected to the mind as well as the body, and Naruto had eventually grown fond of the fuzzball. Not to say the demon was a gentle, caring and misunderstood beast. Kyuubi was a gruff, tough old fox that had enjoyed taking down Konoha. He'd had his reasons, but he never regretted killing the shinobi of Konoha. He had never been kind and gentle to Naruto. He'd been a slave-driving, maniac teacher who had never held back or sugar-coated anything. Konoha had every reason to hate the fuzzball, which Naruto acknowledged even though he knew that they still had no reason to hate him because of that. But still, Iruka didn't have to look at him like that. He wondered what family of the teachers Kyuubi had killed. Someone close to him, for Iruka to sending him a look so dirty. A father, brother perhaps? His whole family maybe? You are allowed to participate, Uzumaki. Iruka's strained voice interrupted his musings. Naruto nodded sharply and turned to return to his seat, never noticing the half-confused, half-angry look Iruka sent at his back. Prejudice is a great time-saver. It enables you to form opinions without bothering to get facts. Unknown. Amino Iruka watched as the Uzumaki kid walked back to his seat with confused eyes. He had no idea why Sandame-sama was allowing that demon to participate in his class, especially knowing what it had taken away from him, and he felt slightly betrayed that his leader would allow the brat in. However, Uzumaki hadn't even reacted to his angry tone. The brat had taken it calmly and maturely, which was making Iruka's inner conscience feel guilty, which only made him angrier. He didn't like that the Kyuubi brat was making him feel guilty. Truthfully, Uzumaki wasn't what he had expected. True, the boy's coloring was a little exotic, but nothing about him seemed to scream, "I am an evil fox demon, kill me." Iruka watched as the boy sat himself between the Haruno heir and the youngest Uchiha, anger fading away to be replaced with bemusement. Shaking his stray thoughts away, Iruka stood at the front of the class, gathering his students' attention quickly. "Hello," he started, smiling at them all. "Today is the day for your genin exams, and the day you will be joining the world of the adults." Iruka thought he heard a snort come from Uzumaki's direction, but when he looked, the brat was watching him innocently. "Your test is divided into 3 parts. There is a written exam, a weapon test, and a chakra test. When I call your name you will enter the room next door so we can begin." Looking at their eager faces, Iruka was struck by how young some of these teenagers seemed. Most of them held onto their innocence, remaining unaware of the harsher aspects of the ninja life. In some ways it made him happy and sad. Happy that they held onto their childishness and sad that they would soon lose it. His eyes were drawn however to the 2 students who were darker than their classmates, the students that held very little naivety for what would come next. He was already aware that Uchiha Sasuke had long since lost his innocence. The Uchiha massacre was a well-known tragedy in Konoha. Iruka knew that Sasuke and his older brother Itachi had been out, getting groceries for their mother and returned to find most of the clan brutally murdered. The killer hadn't been identified and as of yet was still a mystery. Sasuke had changed fairly dramatically after that event, changing from a cheerful child to a withdrawn one. He'd seen death and Iruka knew that that would make him less innocent than his classmates. However, he was somewhat surprised to see that the second teenager who seemed to have lost his innocence was none other than the resident demon Uzumaki Naruto. He had no idea what the brat's life was like. He didn't pay attention to demons. He, like the rest of the village, had forgotten about Uzumaki after they had found out about his disappearance. He wondered, for a second, what kind of experience had made Uzumaki lose his innocence. Iruka shook his head to clear stray thoughts and said to his now restless class, "First up, Aburame Shino." The tall, silent boy slid out of his seat and followed Iruka into the next room. The genin exams, Iruka decided after 3 hours of students, were tiring and frustrating. Some students did well, like Haruno Sakura, and some failed. Some even blacked out from nervousness like Hyuga Hinata. He was so glad he only had to do this once a year. Thankfully he only had 3 students left: Uzumaki, Uchiha, and Yamanaka. Uchiha Sasuke strolled into the room nonchalantly, his blank black eyes fixed on Iruka. Iruka shivered lightly and instructed his student to sit and begin his written test, all the while watching Sasuke from the corner of his eye. Sasuke was said to be an Uchiha genius, but Iruka wasn't so sure about that. In his younger years before the clan's annihilation, the youngest Uchiha had been bright, happy, and talented. After the massacre, however, Sasuke's light had burned out, leaving a shell of the person he used to be. His talent had become stagnant and repetitive, leaving no room for new techniques or ideas. It was a sad thing to see for Iruka, as he knew unless someone became precious in Sasuke's life, he doubted the Uchiha would become a better shinobi. He took the test from Sasuke, scanning the answers and allowing a smile to overtake his face as he saw they were all correct. Next he waved his student to the targets, telling him to aim for the vital points. Once again, Sasuke did excellently, all of his shuriken hitting the vital points dead on. Finally Iruka instructed Sasuke to make 3 bunshin and smiled again as the Uchiha did so effortlessly. Iruka handed Sasuke his headband and told him to inform Uzumaki he was up next. He sat down nervously. This was the exam that he had been dreading all day. He wasn't sure how he was supposed to deal with that demon being so close to him. Uzumaki walked quickly into the room, his long trench coat flaring around his hips. Iruka tried to maintain his neutral expression, but some of his hatred must have leaked through because Uzumaki's blue eyes had hardened and shifted away from him. The brat sat down at his desk and started his written exam promptly. Iruka took the paper slowly when Uzumaki was done, somewhat reluctant to touch anything already touched by a demon. He quickly scanned the answers and nodded to himself. All answers were good, dependable, and fairly accurate, nothing out of the ordinary. Iruka ushered Uzumaki to the target boards, watching keenly as the brat threw his kunai. His aim was good, although Iruka noticed a faint twitch in his muscles as he threw, too. He hit most of the marked places accurately, and those that he didn't ended up fairly close. Finally there was the chakra exam, which he instructed Uzumaki to make 3 bunshin. He could have sworn he felt the brief, heavy pressure of an incredibly powerful chakra, but in the next instance it was gone, leaving only his blonde student and the 3 clones. Iruka shook his head, clearing the cobwebs, and handed Uzumaki his headband. He didn't have a valid reason to fail the brat, unfortunately. "Thanks Iruka-sensei," Uzumaki said brightly, tying the headband over his black bandana. Iruka felt his stomach twist but forced it away, glaring at the boy instead. He tried to ignore the guilt when he saw the brat's smile become fixed instead of natural. He had no reason to feel guilty. "Tell Yamanaka she's next," he said tonelessly, and watched Uzumaki leave the room before sitting down in his seat with a sigh. He could only hope his last student would be less troublesome than the 2 before her. He already had enough of a headache. The most dangerous enemy is that which no one fears. Angels and Demons by Dan Brown. Naruto returned to the hotel room Jiraiya had rented and closed the door with a sigh of relief. His new mentor wasn't back yet, and the room was quiet. Naruto made his way to his bed, picking up the clothes he had discarded earlier that still had his scrolls attached to them. He hadn't wanted to attract attention by wearing the scrolls. He attracted enough with his strange eye and hair colors, not to mention his attitude in classroom 5. Naruto fingered the well-worn scrolls and smiled. When he was younger, Raiden had introduced him to the art of sealing, something that his adopted brother had learned alongside his father. Despite the fact that Raiden had never been as good at sealing as Yondaime, he still taught Naruto quickly and efficiently, leading him to get the second highest level of his apprenticeship in 3 years. However, to get any higher than that, Naruto would have to find a real master, such as the Gamma Sannin Jiraiya. Still wearing a smile, Naruto unfolded the scroll quickly. Inside were lines of delicate kanji swirling around his trademark, the thick, three-line spiral. Gathering a small amount of his chakra, Naruto bit his thumb and allowed the blood to leak onto the spiral, releasing the seal he had placed upon most of his possessions. When the chakra settled, there were items spread across the thin paper. Naruto picked up the two fans first, opening them to allow the painted picture on the razor-sharp metal to shine through. The first fan, which he had named Chugi, had the Konoha leaf painted on it in deep green with a black background. The second fan was named Gammon and had a detailed picture of a crimson-red Kyuubi painted on it with swirls of orange and yellow as its background. He had gotten them mainly because of his wind-based attacks and chakra, and had the pictures painted on them to remind him of the two things he valued most in life. Naruto admired them for a minute before allowing them to snap closed and attach them to his black shinobi belt. Next came his three sai, all of them named Bue. Their handles were made from dark brown ash wood, and the long baton in the middle was made from sharp silver. They all had an octagonal shape and the Uzumaki spiral engraved on the hilts so he could recognize them easily. He spun each of them around his index finger once, smiling at the balanced weight, before slipping them onto his belt as well. His knives came next. His first knife, the one he had gotten when he was 7, was named Sado and had a thin, straight 13N. Steel-coated blade with an edge of silver with a hilt dyed a deep crimson red. His second knife, which he had gotten at 9, was named Suraisu and had a thicker 12N. Blade made from pure steel that curved slightly to resemble a scimitar. The hilt was colored a deep green. Naruto slid one of them into each boot for easy access whenever possible. His final weapons were his senbon, which had never decided to name. The slender, silver needles went into his pack until he needed them further. Naruto sighed, feeling better now that he had all of his weapons on him. Ginkazi, his sword, was a safety blanket in Konoha, but he would never feel completely safe unless he was fully armed. He looked down at the final two items that had been in his scroll and smiled sadly. These two possessions would always well up a bittersweet feeling to him. In shinobi society, when there is a single heir to a clan and no head, a scenario which has become extremely possible in the last 20 years, due to Kyuubi and the Iwa Wars. The heir was appointed as the head to his clan when he reached 12, the normal age for him to become a genin. Naruto hadn't been an exception to this tradition. He fingered his first head ring, a beaten band of silver with the Uzumaki spiral etched onto the outside. His fingers traced the inside of its round surface, feeling the faint engraving of the family motto, "Either find a way or make one." He smiled as he slipped the ring onto his right middle finger. That motto suited the Uzumaki family, a clan known for their determination and mule-like stubbornness. Naruto picked up the second ring slowly, the bittersweet feeling rising up higher in his throat. His mother's ring never evoked such a strong feeling because he never heard about what happened to her on that night. But his father's ring, holding the head ring of the man who had both condemned him and sired him, brought a powerfully sad and unhappy feeling into his throat. Naruto stared down at the onyx-made ring that had golden leaves engraved along the edges. In his mind's eye he could see the family motto written out in bold kanji, "The precious make the sword sharper." With an ache in his chest, Naruto slipped the ring onto his left middle finger. Naruto stared down his now blank seal for a few moments before sighing and rolling it back up to attach to his belt. He also attached the 3 other blank scrolls he had to his belt before leaving quickly and quietly through the window, with only the 4 missing items to show that he had been there to begin with. The only good is knowledge and the only evil is ignorance. Socrates. Sarutobi watched as Jiraiya paced in front of his desk and frowned thoughtfully. Truthfully, with all the havoc Naruto had caused with his reappearance, he had forgotten Jiraiya had needed to make a report. He leaned forward in his chair, setting his pipe to the side with only a mournful glance. "What was it you need to speak with me about, Jiraiya?" he asked, his calm voice a complete opposite to Jiraiya's flustered pacing. Jiraiya sighed and stopped in front of his desk, crossing his arms across a broad chest. He said quietly, "My sources have gotten news of Orochimaru and a new organization, Akatsuki." Sarutobi raised a gray eyebrow and frowned thoughtfully. "Red Dawn?" he thought to himself with a mental snort. This Akatsuki must have a sense of drama. However, the news that Orochimaru is on the move is troubling. "Can you tell what Orochimaru is planning?" he asked directly. Jiraiya shook his head, obviously exasperated. I have no idea what that crazy idiot is doing, only that whatever his plans are, they will be big. He's been gone late at night and has spoken of meetings of important value to his future schemes. And what of this Akatsuki? You wouldn't mention them unless they bothered you, Jiraiya, Sarutobi asked quietly. Jiraiya sighed. They, as far as I can tell, have set their sights on the demons, which puts Naruto in obvious danger. Other than that, their actions are shadowed. I have no idea what they are doing now, only that they are powerful and sneaky, which is always a dangerous combination. The Chunin exams in 3 months would be a perfect time for anyone to attack with so many foreign shinobi coming in and out. I want you to be careful, Sarutobi-sensei. Sarutobi smiled to himself. Jiraiya, no matter how much he projected a gruff exterior, always had cared for his team's safety, especially after Orochimaru. He said aloud, I will, Jiraiya, I will. The two fell into silence and stared out over the darkening sky of Konoha, neither knowing that the promise given that day would be broken in less than a year. When Naruto woke, the sun was shining down on his face through the uncurtained window. He groaned, flipping onto his side and wondering why morning always had to come so quickly. Despite his early morning yesterday, Uzumaki Naruto could never be defined as one of those evil beings known as morning people. After a few minutes of uselessly trying to get back to sleep, Naruto sighed and sat up in his comfortable bed, pouting as he slipped out from underneath the plain white covers. And the bed still looked so comfy too. Naruto padded across the room before he could give in to temptation, dressed in the loose boxers and sleeveless white shirt he always wore to sleep. He quickly grabbed his clothes for the day and headed into the bathroom, getting undressed and stepping into the shower. Still half asleep, he scrubbed through his blonde hair and over his body and face until he was more alert and clean as well. Stepping out, he grabbed a towel and dried himself off before starting to get dressed. Naruto slipped into his underwear and black cargo pants, slipping on his shinobi pouch and belt as well. His sleeveless gray shirt and gray trench coat followed closely after that, followed by his black combat boots. Finally, he pulled on his gloves and tied a gray bandana around his hair before putting on his shinobi headband over it. He slipped out of the bathroom fully dressed and grabbed Ginkazi before heading to the door. He would have brought the rest of his weapons with him, but to considering the place he was heading, it probably wouldn't be the greatest idea he'd ever had. Plus he knew that his Junin sensei wouldn't make them do anything that needed his weapons on the first day. Naruto raised a single blonde eyebrow, a trick that had taken many years of practice and tutoring from Rai-ni-san before he had gotten it down, at the sight of Jiraiya, who was attached to the window with a pair of binoculars to his eyes and blood running down his nose. Naruto sighed as he watched the older man giggle and blush at whatever poor lady he was peeping at through the window. How had he gotten stuck with such a pervert again? Naruto passed the giggling man and shouted out as he opened the door, I'm going out, Ero Sennin, and I'll be back sometime after noon. Don't die from blood loss, I still need your useless ass. Ah, the love. Naruto stopped as soon as he was outside, rubbing the top of his cloth-covered head. Now where to find the place he wanted to go? He really couldn't wait for Rai-ni-san to get here so he could get a tour. Sighing, Naruto turned in a random direction and started to walk. He grinned when he reached a market. What a perfect place to ask for directions. Naruto scurried up to the nearest stand, Dango by the looks of it. The woman selling them was plump, short, and elderly with waist-length white hair pulled up into a high ponytail. Anyo? Naruto said hesitantly, making kind brown eyes fly up to meet his own. Do you think you could tell me where to find the Uchiha estate, Oba-san? The woman smiled, making crinkles appear at the edges of her mouth and eyes. Of course, young man, of course. Let me see, she tapped her chin thoughtfully. I believe the Uchiha estates are down that way. She gestured to the road Naruto had been traveling on, about a half-mile or so, and then to your left. They should be only a little ways after the academy if you get lost, sweetie. Naruto gaped when she called him sweetie, but the old woman just winked at him, making him harumph. Arigato gozaimasu, he said, dropping into a short bow before hurrying down the road he came by. The woman watched him go with indulgent eyes before shaking her head and returning to her work, muttering about impatient younglings. Naruto had always been fast, so what should have been a half-hour trip got cut down to barely 10 minutes. The Dango seller's directions had helped out a lot, especially with the hint about the academy. He had made it there and only gotten lost twice. Naruto had heard stories about the Uchiha estate from Itachi-sensei. The older boy had described it as large and luxurious, with too many things for too little people. However, standing in front of its gates now, the only word Naruto could come up with was creepy. The house was painted black, and had little other color to it, except the flashes of the trademark Uchiha symbol painted here and there on the outside. It was a huge Victorian-style mansion with high, pointed ceilings and large stained glass windows. Naruto sighed and opened the black, spiked gates, shuddering when they creaked ominously. He may have been a shinobi, but he really hated all things creepy and crawly. Naruto leapt his way down the long alley to the house, wondering if this had been a good idea. He could always come back later and hope that maybe the Uchihas had painted their house pink or something to make it seem less dreary. The idea of the gloomy, magnificent mansion being painted a cheery pink made Naruto a little less nervous and a little more amused. In a corner of his mind he was plotting how exactly he could get it done, and how much paint it would take to get the whole house. Inner Naruto rubbed his hands together evilly, cackling all the while. Outer Naruto rolled his eyes. Completely relaxed due to his bout of insanity, Naruto grinned as he reached the tall, oak door. Raising a tan hand he knocked 3 times, wondering if he should return to being nervous when his knocks echoed suspiciously. Naruto swallowed and waited, a booted foot tapping impatiently. Slowly the door creaked open. Naruto had mentally prepared himself for this meeting the entire run over to the Uchiha estates. He had assured himself that he would be strong, manly, and unemotional. He would not embarrass himself by acting like some sissy girl reunited with her one true love. However, all of that went flying out of his head as soon as he saw Uchiha Itachi. Naruto flew at the older boy, wrapping him in a huge hug and pressing his face into the crook of Itachi's neck, breathing in his scent. He felt Itachi stiffen and mentally smiled. His sensei had never got used to being hugged, no matter how many times Naruto had randomly sprang one on him in the past. Slowly, very slowly, in Naruto's opinion, Itachi relaxed, although he didn't do anything more than stand there and let Naruto hug the stuffing out of him. Naruto pulled back soon after that, and scanned Itachi's face eagerly, drinking in the sight of his sensei after being apart for so long. He looked older. The lines under his eyes that had been faint when they had first met had deepened, giving him a more mature look. Naruto was relieved to see the charcoal black eyes instead of the flashing red of Sharingan. Both he and Raiden had lectured Itachi about the dangers of keeping his bloodline activated all the time, and apparently the Uchiha had taken it to heart. The lines of his face seemed sharper, and his cheeks had lost the small amount of baby fat Itachi had had when they had first met. However, despite these changes, Itachi still looked very much the same. His long, silky black hair and narrow, tilted eyes hadn't changed at all. "I'm back, Itachi-sensei," he said, beaming at the older boy. Itachi gave him a look, number 12 on the list of Uchiha Itachi's expressions. "Way to state the obvious, you moron," before saying, "Naruto-kun." Naruto rolled his eyes at the typical greeting. It would probably scar Itachi for life to say more than the occasional short sentence. "Well?" the blonde demanded, moving a little farther away from Itachi and placing his hands on his hips. "Are you going to let me in or not?" Itachi raised an eyebrow. "How rude, Naruto-kun," before turning around and heading back through the door, Naruto following closely. It had surprised him when he could start reading out what Itachi was saying through his facial expressions. When he told Raiden his Ni-san had gotten this funny look on his face and had muttered something about his baby growing up already. Naruto shook his head. Ni-san was weird. He scanned the hallways, rolling his eyes when he noticed that it was as dark and gloomy as the outside of the house was. How typically Uchiha. Itachi led him into the sitting room, a large room with the bare minimum of furniture needed, bare walls, and no windows. Naruto felt like rolling his eyes again. How he had gotten with such a cheapskate for a sensei he had no idea. Sighing, he sank into one of the straight-back chairs surrounding a round table and folded his hands under his chin, staring up at Itachi through long eyelashes. Itachi swept into the chair across from him, his eyes unreadable even to Naruto. The silence stretched for a moment. "When did you get back?" Itachi asked finally, his voice flat. Naruto grinned. "Just yesterday, in fact. I would have come sooner, but Ero Sennin and I had a hard time finding a hotel that would let the old pervert in. Especially after he started flirting with all the female workers, and then I had to do those stupid genin exams. I would have come after that, but I was really exhausted, so I just decided to stop by first thing in the morning. Itachi nodded indifferently, although Naruto could see a spark of amusement at his babble inside the dark eyes. He huffed and glared playfully at the older boy. Raiden? Itachi asked quietly. Naruto rolled his eyes again. Stay back, the lazy ass. He'll probably be here soon. He could never be away from me long. Anyhow, there is a reason to my contagious visit besides informing you that the one and only Uzumaki-sama has arrived. Naruto grinned as Itachi huffed at his arrogance. However, the smile soon wiped off his face. I met your brother yesterday. His name's Sasuke, right? Itachi gave a bare hint of a nod. His black eyes narrowed onto Naruto's face. Have you been training him? Itachi said softly. Sasuke's training has been neglected. Naruto raised an eyebrow. I can see that. His power levels are way below yours, and only a little higher than the rest of the genin in my class. But why was his training neglected? You know better than to coddle him and let him sit around and do nothing. Itachi gave him a look. Naruto sighed. I'm guessing either your Anbu duties or the Uchiha massacre affected him negatively. As quiet as ever, Itachi answered. The clan's massacre affected Sasuke greatly. He has become a stale shell of the talented child he used to be. My Anbu duties also kept me from spending as much time with him as I would have liked. Naruto felt like falling off his chair in shock at hearing Itachi speak 3 full sentences together, if only to clear the mood a little, but felt that his sensei wouldn't appreciate it. He sighed and leaned forwards in his chair, his blue eyes intensely focused on Itachi's face. He's not doing well, Itachi-sensei. His aura is clouded with revenge and every good emotion has the tinge of darkness to it. If he continues this way, in a few years he will be insane. Only those closest to Itachi would notice the slight tightening around his eyes at those words. Naruto said nothing about the worry he could see in the older boy's face and instead continued to watch him and wait for an answer. Itachi sighed. Please watch over him, Naruto-kun, he asked, dropping his head in a subservient manner. In Itachi's mind, there was nothing else to be done. He couldn't help his brother, he had no experience with comfort or coddling, and didn't spend enough time with the boy as it was. Sasuke had no close friends to turn to, or any mentors to guide him away from the dark path he seemed to be taking. However, if anyone could help him, it would be Naruto, the boy with the sunny nature, too kind heart, and perceptive eyes. Naruto, whether he knew it or not, drew people to him like moths to a candle, except that instead of burning they were warmed by his large affection. He could heal even the most twisted of hearts, Itachi knew all too well. After all, Naruto had been the one to save him as well. Flashback. Hey, Itachi blinked, trying to keep from dropping back into darkness. He slowly turned his head, wincing as he felt the dry blood spread over his skull crack and ooze slightly. There, standing in front of him, was a boy. A cute boy, in fact, with sunny spiked hair and large blue eyes. However, the boy was dressed in dark gray ninja clothing, obviously not a civilian. Itachi was trying to remember why it was a problem that he should run into any shinobi, but his fuzzy mind couldn't come up with any reasons. The little boy knelt down beside Itachi and stared at him with curious, cat-like blue eyes before saying, "Nay, Oni-san, what happened to you?" Itachi stared at the child as he tried to remember why he had come to be in this state, and yet like the problem with meeting shinobi, all he got were fuzzy memories he couldn't make out. Itachi shook his head, indicating that he had no answer. The little boy huffed. Well, alright then. I'll get you to Rai-ni-san and Hisoka-chan, and they'll fix up right up, alright Oni-san? Itachi concluded that the boy was stronger than he looked when the little blonde raised him to his feet with what looked like no effort at all. The boy carefully wrapped an arm around Itachi's waist. The child came up to mid-chest when they stood next to each other. Itachi leaned heavily on him, wincing when he heard one of his cracked rib pieces rubbing together in a grinding sort of way, and several scabbed wounds reopen. The boy seemed to notice his discomfort and strived to go as slowly as possible. We're nearly there, he informed Itachi seriously. Itachi tried to nod, but stopped immediately. Moving his head made his temples throb spectacularly and sent black spots dancing around his eyes. Obviously, it was not a good idea. The strange pair approached a small house made out of dark brown wood and 2 little windows. Itachi couldn't help but think it looked like one of those quaint cabins his father would always sneer about. Itachi snorted, making the boy look up at him with curious eyes. He just glared until the little blonde shrugged and turned away. They entered through the front door without knocking, something Itachi wasn't used to doing, even as a shinobi. His family was been high-class, snobbish, and entirely too strict on manners. No one ever entered a house or even a room without knocking first, even in the direst of emergencies. Itachi found it distasteful and slightly ridiculous, but followed the rules all the same. Every Uchiha did. They entered the living area, where two people were sitting. For some reason Itachi thought he should know one of them, but his memories were still fuzzy and he couldn't make out how he should know them. He could see the black closing in around his eyes. He was starting to fall unconscious. However, the boy kept his hold onto him, even as Itachi settled all his weight on him and they both started to droop to the floor. "My name's Uzumaki Naruto," he said, and his blinding smile was the last thing Itachi saw before he surrendered to the darkness of sleep. End flashback. Naruto stared at Itachi with wide eyes, wondering if had, in fact, heard the tensei correctly. Itachi wasn't one to ask for help. His stubborn Uchiha pride wouldn't allow it. He must care quite a bit about Sasuke to swallow his pride like that, Naruto mused, eyeing Itachi thoughtfully. "I will look after him the best I can." "You know I will, Itachi-sensei," Naruto answered, his usually exuberant voice quiet. And Itachi knew that, of course. Naruto, for some unknown reason, couldn't stand to see people in pain. The blonde was always helping others, keeping others sane by his large heart and cheery ways. Itachi knew that even if he had not asked, Naruto would have helped Sasuke anyway, because that was a part of who he was. "Yes," Itachi said, equally as quiet. The room descended into silence for a moment before Naruto huffed and said loudly, "Well, now that we're done with that depressing bit of conversation, I probably should get going." "It's what?" Naruto glanced up at the clock hanging about the door, 11:45 already. "Damn, I'm gonna be late." Itachi watched with amusement as Naruto hurried out of his chair and out of the living room. He didn't get up from his seat. A minute later, Naruto's head popped back into the door, looking sheepish. "Sorry, Itachi-sensei," he yelled. "I'll see you after the team meetups, alright? Maybe tomorrow we can do something." And then he was gone again, his chakra and presence disappearing fluidly from Itachi's range. Itachi let a small half-smile cross over his face as he leaned back in his chair languidly. Even if he would never admit aloud, he was glad to have Naruto back in his life. Grief can be a burden, but also an anchor. You get used to the weight, to how it holds you to a place. The Truth About Forever by Sarah Dessen, Macy. When Naruto entered classroom 5, it was just as noisy as it had been the day before, only without the hordes of screaming banshees crowding around Uchiha Sasuke. The blonde sighed in relief. He really didn't feel like dealing with those bloodthirsty, scary girls right now. He strode to the back of the room where the younger Uchiha was leaning back in his chair with his eyes closed and his head tilted towards the ceiling and slid into the seat next to him. Startled by the unexpected neighbor, Sasuke's eyes opened and his head snapped to the side. He relaxed, however, when he saw it was only the blonde from yesterday that had saved, not that he would ever admit it, his ass from his crazed fangirls. Naruto smiled in amusement at the quick succession of panic and relief that flashed across the Uchiha's aura. He had activated his bloodline after leaving the Uchiha estate just for the purpose of getting a closer look at the people who would be his team. He was going to be spending a lot of time with his teammates, and he wanted to get a look at their personalities and power level as early as possible. Naruto watched as the rest of the class filed in, smirking inwardly when he saw more than one dirty look thrown at him by a USRFA member. He idled his time by picking out some of the stronger students. A girl with short dark hair and the trademark light eyes of a Hyuga was clearly above her classmates, and about even with Sasuke. There were 3 boys also, who were closer to the Hyugas and Sasuke's range. A guy wearing sunglasses with poofy black hair, another with a top knot of spiked dark hair that was half asleep on his desk, and the last was a guy with shaggy brown hair, dark eyes, and a puppy in his jacket. Naruto raised an eyebrow. He could recognize their clans plainly by their looks, an Aburame, a Nara, and an Inuzuka. However, it was surprising that, besides him, Sasuke, and the Hyuga girl, that they were strongest out of the lot. Naras were known more for their strategic mind, and both the Aburame and Inuzuka clan relied on their animals to win a battle. They weren't known to be that powerful, especially when dealing with chakra. Were the rest of Genin really that weak? Naruto was startled out of his musings when Iruka entered the classroom, carrying a pile of papers and wearing a smile. The dark-haired teacher dumped his pile onto the desk in the front before picking up a single sheet. Naruto leaned forward in anticipation. He had been waiting for this moment. Iruka cleared his throat and the room fell silent. Team 1, he started, is Himura Sanosuke, Kurosaki Byakuya, and Amy Rukia. Your Junin sensei is Shiranui Genma. Team 2 is still in rotation from last year. Team 3. Naruto sighed and tuned the man out. He had no desire to know what everyone else's team was. He kept his senses open so he would hear his name called out and turned his attention out the window. Team 7 is Uchiha Sasuke. Naruto perked up, interested to see who was on the team with Itachi's little brother, Haruno Sakura. Naruto winced in sympathy, and Uzumaki Naruto. The room was dead silent for a minute before Naruto said, "What?" That broke the ice. Sakura jumped up, screaming, like the banshee she was, with joy, and Sasuke slumped visibly in his chair. While Uzumaki might not be that bad, he was stuck on a team with one of his fangirls. Why couldn't he have gotten Hinata? She, at least, didn't obsess over him. Iruka hid a smile and continued, your Junin sensei is Hitaki Kakashi. Team 8 is Inuzuka Kiba, Aburame Shino, and Hyuga Hinata. Your Junin sensei is Yuhi Kurenai. Team 9 is still in rotation from last year. Team 10 consists of Yamanaka Ino. Naruto perked up from where he had slumped in defeat. He was stuck with Sakura. Sakura, the rapid Uchiha fangirl, then glanced at Ino, who was leaning forward in her seat, Nara Shikamaru, and Akamichi Choji. Your Junin sensei is Sarutobi Asuma. Naruto held a hand over his mouth to block his smile. Ino was currently alternating between wailing about the injustice of life and hitting a protesting Shikamaru over the head. Iruka ignored the chaos and rolled up the list of teams as he said, congratulations on your team placing. Please wait for your Junin sensei here. Naruto sighed as he watched Iruka smile cheerily at them. He was glad that he was with Sasuke, because that would make his job of looking after the younger Uchiha much easier. Sakura on the other hand, he snuck a glance at the excited pinkette and rolled his eyes. It would take a lot of work to get her mind out of the fangirl setting, and her banshee-like screeches were making him dislike her more than he already did. Perhaps, in time they could be friends, but that would never happen until she lessened her fixation on Sasuke and started to work harder to become a real kunoichi. Naruto leaned back in his seat, surveying the room, and frowned as he noticed that most of the teams had already been picked up by their Junin sensei. He looked over at Iruka, who was sitting at his desk marking papers. Oi, Iruka-sensei, he called out, and he didn't miss the flash of annoyance that passed over the teacher's face as he looked up. Yes, Uzumaki? Iruka asked curtly. Is this Hitaki Kakashi guy always late? Naruto was somewhat curious about his sensei. Raiden had spoken of him, but only about his past somewhat, that Kakashi had been placed in a team under his father with an Uchiha Obito and a Yamaro Ren. However, Rai-ni-san spoke highly of the Junin and Naruto wanted to meet him to see what all the fuss was about. Iruka looked somewhat amused as he answered, Hitaki-san is well known for his lateness, Uzumaki. You'll probably be here for a while. Naruto's eyebrow twitched. He really didn't want to wait here for Kakashi to show up. He frowned slightly. Oi, a deep voice echoed in the back of Naruto's head, making the blonde roll his eyes. I remember your sensei. He was younger when I first saw him, a scrawny shrimp with gray hair and a mask. Didn't give me much of a fight though. Kyuubi almost sounded wistful. Naruto snorted. The old fox really did enjoy a challenge too much. I could probably sniff him out for you. Listening to your whining is more than I can bear. I wasn't whining. Naruto insisted indignantly, even as he left his seat to stand by the windows. I was brooding elegantly. Kyuubi snorted, you couldn't brood to save your life, let alone brood elegantly. Naruto snorted and opened the window. Sakura noticed what he was doing and came up behind him curiously. What are you doing, Uzumaki? She asked, somewhat snidely. Naruto glanced over his shoulder at her coolly. I'm going to find our sensei. I don't want to be here longer than I have to Haruno. With that he leapt out of the window, ignoring the shriek of surprise that Sakura let out. Quickly he attached himself to the side of the academy and ran the rest of the way down to the ground. He let out a laugh when he heard Sakura's yell to come back, and continued to run, allowing Kyuubi to sniff out Kakashi's scent. "He's by the stone with the ninja on it," Kyuubi said after a minute of searching. Naruto's smile slid off his face, although he continued to run. Rai-ni-san had mentioned that Kakashi's teammates had died, Uchiha Obito in a skirmish with Iwa Shinobi, as well as Yamaro Rin and his father dying only a few years later when Kyuubi attacked. It didn't surprise Naruto that Kakashi was at the memorial stone. His teammates' names would have been carved into it, as every shinobi that had died in both the Iwa Wars and Kyuubi attack had been placed on the large rock. Naruto jumped to the rooftops, heading swiftly for the stone. He had a vague idea where it was. When he had been younger he hadn't spent much time wandering around Konoha due to the beatings. He had stayed indoors, only traveling to Ichiraku's and the grocery store when he absolutely needed to. His safety had never allowed him to travel to any place he didn't absolutely need to visit. Naruto stopped at the edge of the clearing where the memorial stone was placed and watched for a minute. Hitaki Kakashi was a tall man with drooping spikes of silver-gray hair and a mask covering half of his face. Naruto knew that this was because of some strange Hitaki tradition, but Rai-ni-san had never gone into the specifics. The Junin's headband was tilted over his left eye, concealing the Sharingan eye he had received from his dying teammate. One white-knuckled hand held an orange book that Naruto recognized immediately. Ero Sennin had spent the greater time of their travels together researching and raving about his Icha series. Naruto stepped into the clearing and his eyebrows knotted when Kakashi didn't even raise his head. A Junin of his caliber, even now his power level shone an icy green-white, should have noticed Naruto immediately. The blonde hurried up to his new sensei's side and got an eyeful of his aura. Blue had always been described as the color of sadness. Naruto had studied colors and emotions thoroughly, and knew that emotions had certain levels to them in a way. Stronger emotions had more depth and a darker color than superficial ones. And right now he was looking into the sea of blue-black that swirled around Kakashi's core like a particularly violent typhoon. Tints of purple and pure black hidden within the smooth original coloring. Sweet Kami-sama, Naruto thought, alarmed for his new sensei. Kakashi's grief bordered on depression. The darkness of the color and the hints of black showed that. The purple hinted that the sadness had been there so long it had become immersed in his core, a swirling ball of purple, dark crimson red, and white. Kaka-sensei, Naruto barely noticed the affectionate nickname he had given his teacher, too horrified by the deep wells of grief he could see within the man. Kakashi seemed to rouse himself from his dreamlike state and Naruto watched, fascinated, as the swirls of blue-black began to recede bit by bit until they were overtaken by a thin yellow color of fake happiness and contentment. Only a small layer of the original color remained on the outside of the yellow. Naruto was amazed. It took years of training and a huge amount of effort to be able to push back such harsh emotions as the grief he had seen in his sensei. Obviously the man was skilled in more than just jutsu. Kakashi straightened and Naruto noticed that his grip on the orange book had become looser. The Junin's single black eye surveyed him curiously. "Oh, who might you be then, Blondie?" he asked, and Naruto's eyebrow twitched at the mocking edge the Junin's voice had taken. "One of your new students, oh great and powerful Kakashi-sama," Naruto swept into mockingly low bow. "Oh, finally someone has recognized my greatness," Kakashi said dramatically, fanning himself with his book. He peered down at Naruto and the blonde could sense him frowning teasingly through his blue mask. "If only it wasn't this short gaki, I would have preferred hordes of beautiful women." Kakashi sighed wistfully. Naruto's temple throbbed as he leaned up and swatted Kakashi on the back of his head, scowling as he shouted out, "Pervert. It's bad enough Ero Sennin writes those books, but for people to actually read them." Naruto shook his head in mock despair before looking up at the sky and pointing an accusing finger in Kakashi's direction. "Kami-sama, this is who you give me as a sensei to guide me through my genin years? This one?" Naruto felt triumphant when he saw genuine amusement overtaking the fake wall of happiness his sensei had barricaded his grief behind. Considering how quickly Kakashi shifted from deep sadness to bright cheerfulness, Naruto was fairly certain that the Junin hadn't felt actual amusement for quite some time. Care to explain why you came all the way out here, Gaki? Kakashi asked, after the short moment of somewhat awkward silence that followed Naruto's dramatic statement. Naruto gave him a mock glare as he shouted out, "Iruka-sensei said that you would be late, so I found you to drag you back to the academy kicking and screaming. There was no way I was going to wait for your lazy ass to get to the academy." Naruto growled under his breath and pulled impatiently on Kakashi's arm. The older man looked startled and then bemused by his new student's behavior, even as Naruto continued to pull Kakashi across the field and farther away from the memorial stone. Once they were outside the field, Naruto started to run, Kakashi easily keeping up at his side despite the hand still clamped around his wrist. The academy came into view after a few short minutes, and Kakashi mentally sighed. He really didn't want to do this. He shot a glare at his oblivious student. If that stupid Gaki hadn't come, perhaps he would have found a way out of it. Perhaps he could knock the Gaki out and then make a run for it? Naruto, ignoring the dangerous vibes emitting from his sensei, smiled when they reached the main entrance to the academy. The building was empty, as all the teachers had already gone home for the day, which allowed Naruto and Kakashi to navigate their way fairly quickly to classroom 5, entering quietly. Naruto mentally rolled his eyes when he saw Kakashi pull out his orange book and open it to a random page. He wasn't sure if the man was actually reading it or not. The first thing Naruto saw was a nervous-looking Sasuke edging slowly away from a ranting, furious Sakura. When they entered, Sakura immediately turned on them, leaving a visibly relieved Uchiha to relax from her onslaught. "Uzumaki Baka, what did you think you were doing, running off like that? It would have looked bad for Sasuke-kun and me if our sensei had come in while you were gone." She trailed off as she noticed Kakashi. The silver-haired man tapped his masked chin thoughtfully with his orange book as he said, My first impression of you is still not favorable, unfortunately." Naruto rolled his eyes and swatted at Kakashi's head, ignoring Sakura's scandalized gasp at the familiar conduct between subordinate and superior. No matter that Kakashi was supposed to be their sensei, he was still a Junin. Naruto was supposed to be properly respectful and subservient, not smack their teacher, even when he made such a remark as that. Sakura sent a glare in Naruto's direction. But Kakashi ignored her and even Naruto as he chirped, "To the roof, faithful minions, too," and disappeared in a small swirl of leaves. Naruto rolled his eyes yet again at Sakura's shocked look and Sasuke's disappointed one. Obviously they weren't expecting someone like Kakashi to be their Junin sensei. The person that would guide and mentor them through their Genin and Chunin years. He had to say that he hadn't either, but at least he had Jiraiya, Itachi, Kyuubi, and Raiden when he got his lazy ass to Konoha. Naruto shook away his stray thoughts and turned to Sasuke, ignoring Sakura for now. Her little speech when he had come back in had annoyed him, and he didn't want to try talking to her right now, or he was afraid he'd be more than a little rude. And if there was one thing he'd learned during his time with Jiraiya, it was to never piss off a woman. "Coming or not?" he asked the Uchiha. Sasuke nodded and stood up, automatically entering what Naruto had dubbed brood mode. Itachi had used it often too. Naruto quickly swept out of the classroom, Sasuke following closely behind with Sakura trailing after them, looking extremely confused. They reached the roof to find Kakashi leaning against the wall next to the door, trying to look badass. The effect was ruined by his little orange book and the constant stream of giggles he was emitting. With his eyes still glued to the page, Kakashi gestured for them to sit. Sakura did so, but Sasuke and Naruto remained standing, both eyeing Kakashi, one with distaste, the other with curiosity. "Well," Kakashi drawled out, "your all-powerful sensei would like an introduction. Likes, dislikes, hobbies, dreams, goals, all that fun stuff." He carelessly waved a hand. "Pink girl, you're first." Sakura eyed him carefully. "Shouldn't you go first, sensei? So we know what to say?" Kakashi gave her one of his smiles, and Naruto was interested to note that his fake cheerfulness exploded to almost dangerous amounts as he did so. Perhaps Kakashi used it to mask other emotions as well, and it needed to make his happiness stronger to do so? But why would he need to do that? He could be annoyed at them if he wanted, so why was he masking it? Naruto was starting to get even more interested in the puzzle that was Kakashi. Hitaki Kakashi. I have many likes and many dislikes. My hobbies can wait until you're older, and, well, I have a dream. Sakura muttered under her breath before huffing and starting her own introduction. I'm Haruno Sakura. Here she gave a long, sidelong glance at Sasuke before continuing, and I dislike blondes of all kinds. Naruto was given a glare. My hobbies. Sakura began to giggle. My dreams. Her giggles grew louder and more excitable, all while she was looking at Sasuke. Naruto and Kakashi regarded the youngest Uchiha with pity. Kakashi interrupted Sakura's giggle fest by saying loudly, "Broody one, you're up." Uchiha Sasuke. I have some like and many dislikes. I don't have any hobbies, and my dream is really more of an ambition. To restore my clan and to kill a certain man. Silence reigned over the roof until Naruto chuckled and commented, how depressing. It was a good thing looks couldn't kill, or our hero would be buried twice over. Kakashi seemed to be amused by Naruto's comment, but instead of laughing just gestured for the blonde to go next. My name's Uzumaki Naruto. My likes are training, a certain fox, people who believe in me, and ramen. My dislikes are most of the people in this village, prejudice and intolerance. My hobbies are training and playing pranks on unsuspecting persons, and my dream, he trailed off, looking thoughtful, before shrugging. My dream is to make the people in Konoha acknowledge me one way, or another. Naruto was well aware of the sharp glance he had received from Kakashi at his mention of a certain fox, but the Junin had remained silent, to his relief. He knew there would be a confrontation, but he didn't want it to happen in front of his new teammates. He didn't fully trust Sasuke and Sakura yet, at least, not with his secrets. They already were looking at him curiously, probably due to his statement about Konoha. Ma, I suppose that will be it for today. Report to Training Ground 7 at 6:30 a.m. sharp, Kakashi drawled out. Sakura sounded puzzled as she asked, what for sensei? You'll be doing survival training. Kakashi sounded entirely too gleeful for Naruto's peace of mind. But we already did that in the academy. Sakura protested. Naruto was amused at her attitude. Did she really think that the academy standards were that great? The academy was there to teach the students the basics. It was during the genin years that the student grew the most, as they started to get real, one-on-one tutelage. Don't slack off, Kakashi warned, although it was ruined by his jovial tone. Out of 27 graduates, only 9 will be chosen as actual genin. The rest will be sent back to the academy. This is a difficult test with a failure rate of 66. Anyhow, don't eat breakfast tomorrow, you'll only throw up. Ya nay minions of mine. He cackled as he disappeared yet again in a cloud of leaves. The roof was silent until Naruto sighed and said, geez, we just had to have that guy huh? Sasuke grunted while Sakura nodded enthusiastically, probably forgetting that she was agreeing with Naruto. The sole girl of the group turned to Sasuke, a sweet and innocent look overcoming her face as she bent her head shyly. Sakura twirled her fingers behind her back, rocking back and forth on her heels. Sasuke-kun, would you like to have dinner with me? She asked timidly. Sasuke, Naruto noted, had frustration and annoyance flashing over his aura. Obviously this wasn't a new thing. No, the youngest Uchiha's voice was flat as he turned to head back to the rooftop door. Sakura looked crestfallen but resigned as she followed him out. Naruto hesitated for a moment before yelling out, Oi! Uchiha! Sasuke looked at him over his shoulder, a single black eyebrow raised. Talk to Itachi about the test tomorrow. Sasuke's eyes narrowed and he opened his mouth, as if to ask how Naruto knew Itachi, but Naruto shook his head and mouthed, later, at him. Sasuke, eyes still narrowed, nodded stiffly before disappearing from sight down the stairs. Naruto sighed heavily, leaning against the wall behind him. He was not going to enjoy talking about that tomorrow. Oi, he called out lazily. Kaka-sensei, you can come out now. Kakashi emerged from a nearby tree eyeing Naruto suspiciously, his hands free of any orange porn for once. What did you want, sensei? You don't seem like the type to go for younger guys, not that I'd ever date an old pervert like you. Naruto drawled out, amused by the startled surprise that flashed across both Kakashi's aura and face. You know about it? Kakashi asked cautiously. He would, of course, be screwed if Naruto actually didn't know anything, but he got the feeling from the Gaki's introduction and the strange glint in his eye as he mentioned, a certain fox, that the blonde did know. Naruto's amusement faded as he looked up into Kakashi's face warily before saying, "Yes, I know about my furry friend." Kakashi was quiet. He didn't know how to handle this. He hadn't even realized that one of his students was the Kyuubi container until he had looked at the list last night. It had been a shock to see Uzumaki Naruto among his ranks, especially when he knew for a fact that the blonde has disappeared when he was 6. It made him both sad and happy to have Naruto on his team. He was a reminder of all that he had lost that day, but he also looked and acted so much like Minato-sensei. Kakashi was shaken from his thoughts when a small poof of smoke appeared on Naruto's head. The blonde, looking annoyed, reached up and pulled a brightly colored frog off his blonde spikes. An eyebrow visibly twitching, Naruto scowled down at the frog, wondering what Ero Sennin could possibly want now. "What is it, Gamakichi?" he asked. Gamakichi huffed at Naruto's obvious annoyance and answered back sharply, "The old man wants you to come to the Hokage Tower, Whiskers. He said something about the Hokage wanting to yap about your past and getting some sake for the special occasion." Naruto snorted. That sounded like Jiraiya alright. He really didn't want to discuss his past with anyone, but Jiji-sama would need to know, if only to properly sort out missions for both Team 7 and Naruto solely. The blonde sighed and turned to Kakashi, who had watched the interaction between the frog and his student with an interested eye. Naruto looked at him for a minute before sighing again, this time more loudly, and then saying, "You'd better come with me for this, Kaka-sensei. Since you're my new sensei, you'll need to know what to expect from me." He turned back to Gamakichi and barked out, "Tell Ero Sennin we'll be there shortly and to not drink all the sake." Gamakichi snickered and nodded before disappearing in another poof of smoke. Naruto turned back to Kakashi and raised an eyebrow. Kakashi nodded and the two jumped from the academy rooftop to the top of the building next to it, heading swiftly for the Hokage Tower in the middle of Konoha. They reached the tower swiftly and managed to get into the Hokage's office within 10 minutes, a feat that Kakashi had once thought impossible if you went the right way instead of through the windows. He'd heard stories about the long wait line from Asuma and Kurenai, who both were too polite for their own good and always used the door. It impressed him that Naruto had managed to get them a meeting so fast. The Hokage must have cleared out his other appointments to make room for this talk. They entered the Hokage's office, and Naruto snorted when he saw Jiraiya sitting at a comfortable sofa that hadn't been there the day before, guzzling sake like water. Sandaime was sitting at his desk, watching Jiraiya amusedly. Dryly he said, "Didn't I ask for you not to drink all that sake, Ero Sennin? You won't get any anyway, brat," a familiar dark, low voice said from his other side, making Naruto whirl around with wide, blue eyes. The person standing there was both familiar and unexpected. Rai-ni-san? Previously on an Inconvenient Truth. "You won't get any anyway, brat," a familiar dark, low voice said from his other side, making Naruto whirl around with wide, blue eyes. The person standing there was both familiar and unexpected. "Rai-ni-san? Didn't I tell you not to call me that, brat?" Tanaka Raiden stepped out from the shadows of the room, his lazy golden eyes amused and his black hair swept into its familiar tight ponytail. He hadn't changed much since Naruto had first met him. Only the lines of laughter and stress around his eyes and mouth indicated that he had aged at all. Naruto gulped, and for a moment his mind was a complete blank. Then the realization that his Ni-san was there swept over him and he launched himself at Raiden with a loud yell. Kakashi took an alarmed step forward, but stopped when he saw that Naruto wasn't attacking Raiden. The blonde had swept his Ni-san into a tight hug, his face pressed into the tall man's chest and his arms tightly locked around the thin waist. Raiden shifted uncomfortably, trying to loosen the brat's grip so he could breathe again. He'd forgotten how damned clingy Naruto got when they had been apart. "I am human, Blondie," he wheezed out, "I do need air to stay alive." Naruto released him reluctantly but stayed close to Raiden after they had separated, a bright smile on his face. Raiden grumbled under his breath and shot the brat a glare before turning to face an amused Sarutobi. "Raiden-kun arrived just before you did," the old Hokage said to Naruto and Kakashi. He was, in fact, the one who initiated this little meeting. Kakashi spoke up immediately after Sandaime, his eye focused completely on his old friend. "How do you know Naruto, Raiden?" Raiden cast a casual glance down at Naruto that didn't go unnoticed by any in the room, and the blonde nodded. He looked back up at Kakashi and said easily, "He's Minato's son." I took him in. Kakashi stood stock still for several long moments, his single eye wide, before he asked in an ear whisper, "Kushina-chan?" Raiden nodded admiringly. "Got it in one, pervert." Kakashi ignored the nickname and ran his fingers through his hair agitatedly. He'd always suspected that Minato and Kushina had had something going on, but he'd never thought that a child would come out of it. When he'd heard Naruto's last name, he'd assumed, like everyone else who had known the spunky redhead, that the blonde was the son of an unknown husband. To think that his beloved sensei had had a child, Kakashi drew in a slow, long breath. He wanted to yell and rage and break things, but doing that would only make things worse. He needed to be calm. "Do you have proof?" Kakashi asked Naruto. Naruto nodded. "I took a blood test before coming here so I could prove it." Kakashi's eye widened in shock. Blood tests were notoriously hard to manage, and it took years of practice in medicine and extreme finesse in wielding chakra to even attempt doing one. "Who did it for you?" he asked breathlessly. Naruto frowned and shook his head. "They wanted to be kept a secret." Kakashi wanted to push for a name, but the serious look in Naruto's eyes stopped him. Instead he sank into the couch next to a still drinking Jiraiya, his mind still wavering between shock and anger. He knew that he would have figured out Naruto's parentage eventually. He looked too much like Minato to not be related to the dead Hokage in some way, and he had Kushina's name. But still, the thought of his sensei having a child and the anger at not being told that Kushina had been pregnant overwhelmed him. Naruto kept an eye on Kakashi even as he sat in the chair placed in front of the Hokage's desk. He concentrated most of his attention on Sandaime and sat forward, eyes gleaming. "You said you wanted to talk with me, Jiji-sama?" Raiden sighed in the background. It seemed Naruto would never get over the habit of giving annoying nicknames to the people he knew. Sandaime smiled at the blonde. "Yes. I wanted to know the basics of where you traveled and what you learned under Raiden and, I presume, Hisoka." Naruto sat back thoughtfully. "I told you how I met Raiden, yes?" Raiden groaned even as Sandaime nodded. He hadn't wanted anyone to know of his little moment of kindness. "After that we went to Tsuchi no Kuni to look for Hisoka." Flashback. "Are we there yet?" 6-year-old Naruto asked, peering up at Raiden. He watched with interest as the man's eyebrow twitched. He noticed that Rai-ni-san seemed to do that a lot around Naruto. The blonde had asked him about the twitch an hour ago, but Rai-ni-san had only glared at him silently. Naruto pouted and crossed thin arms across his chest. Rai-ni-san was so mean. The blonde had no idea where they were, as Raiden hadn't spoken to him at all beside to tell him orders. Kicking his feet, Naruto trailed behind the older man, his blue eyes fixed on the ground. Had he paid more attention to his surroundings he may have noticed the blur of white and black before he was hauled off the ground like a sack of potatoes. Naruto instantly began yelling for Raiden, all while kicking, biting, and scratching as much of his attacker as he could reach. He was satisfied by the curses muttered by the person behind him. Raiden, who had heard Naruto's cries, ran back only to stop short as he saw who exactly the mysterious attacker was. "Hisoka, what the hell are you doing?" he cried out, rushing up to the two now that his shock was gone. He tugged on one of the hands holding Naruto, dodging a kick and a bite that had come his way. "Let him go. Damn Raiden, you've got yourself one wildcat of an apprentice," Naruto heard his attacker say. "This is your apprentice, right? You're not about to start some sort of brothel for gay pedophiles, are you?" Raiden sputtered indignantly, which made Naruto wonder what was so bad about whatever his attacker was talking about. Maybe he would ask Rai-ni-san about it when the unknown man put him down. "No, he's just my apprentice Hisoka, though you might finish him off before I get to teach him anything." Raiden spat out finally, glaring at his friend for the previous statement. Naruto was finally set and he instantly turned to get a look at his attacker. Hisoka was shorter than Raiden by a few inches, and had long, silver-white hair and dark blue eyes. He was dressed in black, traditional samurai clothing, a haori and hakama as well as gi on his feet. A long, broad sword was strapped to his back. Naruto pouted. Hisoka looked so wimpy. Why couldn't he have been attacked by a 7-foot muscle giant, or someone cool like that? Hisoka knelt down so he was eye to eye with Naruto and observed the blonde for several minutes. Then he sighed and asked Raiden quietly, "Minato's child, then?" Naruto perked up. The wimpy guy had known his dad? Trying to look innocent and naive, Naruto kept his ears open. Raiden nodded and Hisoka glared at him. You knew Minato wanted him to stay there. Raiden growled and spat out. He was getting beaten, Hisoka. Beaten, and treated like the scum of the earth. Minato was my best friend, but I would be the first to admit he was a damned, idealistic fool to believe they would treat him like a hero. Hisoka had paled rapidly when he had heard about Naruto's beatings and shock painted over his features. He had been the one to stop Raiden from going to Naruto earlier, saying that Minato had wanted his son to stay in Konoha. He had never guessed that the villagers would be cruel enough to beat a child. Hisoka passed a hand over his face as he thought grimly, I guess I can be as idealistic as Minato was. Hisoka glanced down at an innocent-looking Naruto and sighed. It wasn't like they could send the kid back now, even if he had wanted to. Did you at least tell Hokage-sama we have him now? He asked Raiden. Raiden shifted nervously, not exactly. Hisoka took a deep breath. What do you mean by not exactly? Raiden laughed uneasily. That I didn't tell him at all? Calmly Hisoka lifted a hand and hit Raiden soundly over the head, the thump sound echoing in the empty clearing. He eyed his friend's fallen body for a moment before shrugging and turning to Naruto. He knelt down again to stand eye to eye and smiled at the small blonde boy. Hello Naruto-kun, he said. I'm Ryu Hisoka. End flashback. Sandaime smiled. He sounds like quite the character, he said. I would like to meet him. Naruto smiled sadly as he answered. He would have loved to meet you as well, Jiji-sama. Sandaime noted the use of the past tense and the weary looks on both Naruto and Raiden's faces. Tucking the information in the back of his mind, he changed the subject. You met with Hisoka in Tsuchi, then what happened? Naruto leaned forward in his seat. We stayed near Iwagakure for the next year or so, while Raiden and Hisoka started my education. Raiden cut in roughly. I taught the brat about chakra. How to use it, how to gather it, how to sense it, the whole shebang. He learned some ninjutsu. Hisoka taught him the basics of various weapons, kunai, shuriken, fans, daggers, sai, katana, and senbon. He was taught 2 elemental kata, the wind and the water, and he knew most of it perfectly by the end of the year. Finally he was taught the basics of stealth, interrogation, and ninja codes. Sandaime nodded thoughtfully, a hard schedule for a beginner. It says a lot about your character that you did as well as you did, Naruto-kun. Naruto smiled wryly. Trust me, it didn't go as smoothly as it sounds. Some of the days I was too tired to even get up and eat. I pranked Raiden like hell and drove Hisoka crazy with my whining. I was lucky to have even survived that first year. Sandaime smiled indulgently but said nothing more on the subject. Instead he continued the conversation. Where did you go after Tsuchi? We went to Mizu no Kuni. The Mizukage wanted Hisoka-chan for a mission there. We stayed in Kirigakure for about 2 years. While we were there I perfected the wind and water kata, and began and finished lightning and fire. Raiden taught me about chakra, ninjutsu, and I began my seals training under him. Hisoka continued to train me in weaponry, with focus on katana, fans, and sai. Together we started to create a sword style to fit my favorite taijutsu style, a mix of water and wind kata. Sandaime raised an eyebrow. Impressive. I had no idea you were a seals apprentice, Naruto-kun. Naruto nodded and pulled out a necklace on a long black cord that had been hanging underneath his shirt, unnoticed by any of the man. On the end was an upside-down triangle made from a shimmering red crystal. Delicate strands of Japanese too small to read rimmed the edges of the pendant. A 5th-level apprentice? Kakashi asked incredulously. Even Jiraiya, who was drunk by now, seemed surprised. Sandaime, however, just smiled, like father, like son. Minato was also skilled with seals. He would be proud to see that you rose so quickly in such a short amount of time. Naruto smiled. It took a lot of pain and hard work to get this far, believe me. I was out for a week after the tests for 5th level. Sandaime nodded. I believe you, Naruto-kun. Did anything else happen in Kiri? Naruto and Raiden exchanged glances again and the room was silent for a long moment. Finally Naruto sighed and turned back to Sandaime. When I was 8 I met Kyuubi no Kitsune. Flashback. 8-year-old Naruto stared at the creepy, slimy tunnel in confusion. The last thing he remembered was passing out after a particularly hard training session with Raiden. How had he gotten here, wherever here was? Cautiously Naruto crept down the twisting hallway, wincing when his feet made a squelching, echoing sound when they hit the wet ground. The place was dark and gloomy with dripping pipes and a slimy ceiling. It gave the blonde creeps just looking at it. After long minutes of walking, Naruto finally reached a dead end. Large, thick bars rose in front of him, their once bronze surface coated over with slime and rust. They were without decoration except for a single, open scroll high above Naruto's head, filled with characters he couldn't make out. Naruto stepped forward hesitantly, until he was only feet away from touching the bars. Without warning, red eyes appeared in the darkness beyond the cage, for what else could it be, making Naruto jump heavily. Slowly the eyes came forward until Naruto could make out the cunning muzzle and the enormous body of a crimson-red fox. 9 thick tails swirled around the fox's huge body, the tips painted black. "So," the fox's voice boomed, echoing loudly in the wet corridor, "this is my brat captor then." The fox bared its teeth in a horrible, mocking grin that sent shivers down Naruto's spine. That blonde ninja was stupid to believe that such a puny mortal could ever hope to contain Kyuubi no Kitsune. Naruto wasn't stupid by any means. This large, scary-looking fox was claiming to be Kyuubi, the fox demon that even the tiniest children in Konoha knew ravaged their village 8 years ago. There was some sort of seal up at the top of the bars, and the villagers had called him demon many times before Raiden rescued him. He took a deep breath. "I'm a container to Kyuubi no Kitsune?" he asked, mostly to himself in surprise. It would explain many things. The hate of the villagers, the fast healing, the sharp senses and fox-like whisker marks. Mind whirling, Naruto looked up to see Kyuubi watching him with interest. "Oh, my host isn't as stupid as I thought," the fox mused aloud. "Come closer, mortal." Naruto scrutinized Kyuubi's face and wicked crimson eyes before lifting his chin and stepping boldly forward. Expecting a slash at his head, Naruto was surprised by the wheezing growl that Kyuubi emitted. It took him a minute to realize it was the fox's version of laughter. "So recklessly foolish, little mortal. But then, you ninja always seem to be that way," Kyuubi told him, lowering his huge furry body to the ground and resting his muzzle on his large paws. Laying down brought him closer to Naruto's eye level, even thought the fox still had to look down at him. "I'm in my mind?" Naruto asked the fox, prepared for his question to remain unanswered. Kyuubi surprised him, yet again, by nodding regally. Naruto pursed his lips and thought. If Kyuubi was sealed into his body, the only person who would have been able to do that would have been Yondaime. Raiden had told him soon after he was rescued that Yondaime was his father, which is why feelings of anger and betrayal coursed through him right now. He could understand the need to defeat Kyuubi, but the thought that his own father had sealed the demon inside of him. Naruto took a deep breath. He needed to stay calm. "How did I get here? The last thing I remember is training with Raiden," he trailed off. Kyuubi snorted. "You came because I summoned you here," he said bluntly. "Unfortunately for me, I have to have a talk with you. Try not to be too stupid so I don't accidentally bash your brains in before we finish." Naruto bristled but stayed quiet. His 3 years under Raiden and Hisoka had taught him to keep a grip on his temper in dangerous situations. Kyuubi stared down at him with glittering red eyes before nodding to himself. The giant fox settled down even lower in his cage, obviously getting comfortable. Taking the hint, Naruto sat down cross-legged on the floor in front of the cage and then cranked his neck up to stare Kyuubi in the eyes. "The gold-eyed ninja already told you the blonde mortal was your sire," Kyuubi started. Naruto absently wondered if Kyuubi ever remembered a human's name, but shook the stray thoughts off. He couldn't afford to be unfocused. "What he never told you was the history of his mate, your mother, who was from the Uzumaki clan." Naruto frowned. What did his mother have to do with any of this? Before he could ask, Kyuubi continued his speech. "The Uzumaki clan was founded in Uzu no Kuni, a land that has been dead many years to the ninja world. The yokai remember it. It was a gathering place for the spring meetings, and it was full of almost intelligent ninja who yokai could tolerate." Coming from Kyuubi, Naruto knew this was a compliment. The Uzumaki clan were well known in the land, and were extremely prosperous. "They are the equivalent to the puny village's red-eyed clan, I believe. They also had a bloodline limit, Reiki Metsuki." Naruto snorted. "Aura Eyes? What an original name." Kyuubi shrugged. "I didn't make it up, ninja. But back to my story. Reiki Metsuki weren't as powerful as the Red-Eyed Clan's bloodline, but it had its uses. For one, aura reading is a useful skill in the ninja shinobi business, or so I've heard. The second was that they could read yokai's souls and track them just as easily as ninja ones. Naruto raised an eyebrow. He still didn't see how that was of any importance. Kyuubi gave him a glare, as if sensing his impatience. When the Uzu Wars ravaged Uzu no Kuni into an unrecognizable wasteland, what was left of the Uzumaki clan, your mother, her brother and their parents, moved to Konoha. She and her brother became a shinobi there, and her parents died early in the years that they spent there. Apparently she became involved with the blonde ninja and you are the product. Her brother, however, was less inclined to move beyond the Uzu Wars that had destroyed life as he knew it. He went after the demon that was discovered to have started the whole conflict, Kyuubi no Kitsune. Naruto's eyes widened and he made a mental note to research the Uzu Wars as soon as possible. He had no idea what they entailed, and apparently they were important in his family's history. As I said before, yokai once used Uzu no Kuni to gather for the spring meetings. Your mother's brother had met me there once, and he knew my aura. He tracked me down, to the nest where my mate and 2 kids were also living. Kyuubi's eyes burned as he related this part of the story and Naruto was shaking. He could see a murky, possible ending to this and he didn't like the idea of it. He hoped to Kami that he was wrong. The ninja wouldn't be satisfied by my death. He wanted to make me suffer. Kyuubi's voice was harsh as he said the last word. He waited until I left to get food for my mate and kits and then attacked. He was skilled. A high-ranking animal mask shinobi, if I'm not mistaken. My mate was weak from the birth of the kits 2 moons before, and my kits were barely born. They didn't stand a chance. Kyuubi was silent, and when Naruto looked up at him he noted that if the demon could show softer emotions he might be crying right now. I came back to find them slaughtered and a Konoha headband lying near their corpses, torn off during the battle. The day was October 10th. Naruto breathed in heavily. So his suspicions had been right. His uncle's actions had provoked Kyuubi to attack Konoha. Don't get me wrong, brat. The murder of my mate and kids moved me to attack your puny village. But I enjoyed every minute of slaughtering those pathetic meatpacks, no matter if they were involved or not. Kyuubi's voice was rough. Naruto shuddered. He could never imagine having such bloodlust. It unnerved him. The fact that he could understand Kyuubi and yet be terribly disgusted and fearful of him at the same time. His actions toward Konoha could be justified, but his mindless slaughter of the innocent could not. What happened to my uncle? Naruto asked quietly. Kyuubi snarled, I don't know. But if I ever find that son of a bitch, I'll make sure he'll die as painfully as I can make possible. Naruto shivered again. Then, drawing up his courage as some sort of security blanket he asked, why are you explaining this to me? And how do you know so much about my mother's family? Kyuubi sighed. The Uzumaki family has interbred with demons before, all of them from my clan, the Kitsune. I kept an eye on them after they moved to Konoha. As for my reasons, I wanted to explain the most obvious obstacle to a decision I am going to ask you to make. Naruto frowned uneasily. Any decision Kyuubi would ask him to make couldn't be a good or easy one. He shifted from one foot to another, considering the consequences, before he said, fire away. Kyuubi's eyes glinted as he purred out, I want you to become my heir. End flashback. The room was silent for long minutes until Kakashi jumped to his feet. The demon was lying. I knew Uzumaki Ryoma. He was nothing like that. He would never murder something without purpose. Naruto smiled grimly. Ah, but Kaka-sensei, you forget. He did have purpose, vengeance. Kakashi seemed to be at a loss for words. Jiraiya stood up next to the silver-haired Junin and gently pushed him back into his seat. He sat again and leaned forward, all previous drunkenness abandoned for the somber occasion. You're positive this is true? Naruto was silent before he said quietly, yes, and you will see why later. Jiraiya raised an eyebrow but Naruto didn't comment, only turned to Sandaime who had been the only to not speak. He frowned when he saw the Hokage's weary face and suddenly comprehension dawned in his mind. You knew, he cried out, all calm forgotten. How? Sandaime nodded slowly, his eyes old and wise. Minato-kun had his suspicions against Kushina's brother, and he wrote notes. When Ryoma disappeared after the Kyuubi attack and we didn't find his body among the dead, I made assumptions. Kyuubi's story only confirms it. What I don't understand, Kakashi spoke again, his voice low, is how Kyuubi even knew Ryoma did it. He only found a Konoha headband, how could he have known the culprit? The Uzumakis placed a swirl on their headbands as a remembrance to their lost country, Naruto explained quietly. Kyuubi knew Kushina to be with a child, and my grandparents were dead. It was process of elimination, and his motives weren't hard to guess at, since Kyuubi is blamed for starting the Uzu Wars. Kakashi sighed heavily and Naruto couldn't help but feel pity for his sensei. It must be a shock to learn all of this, and so closely together. Naruto had had more time to accept it. Sandame pulled the blonde's focus back on track, did you agree? Naruto was silent for a moment before nodding slowly. Sandame sucked in a surprised gasp and then asked, how did you become his heir? I thought it was impossible for humans and demons to merge? My mother's family has mated with kitsune demons in the past. There was just enough demon blood in me for us to merge, Naruto explained. I gained his blood and chakra, but it changed me a bit. Sandame looked at Raiden over Naruto's head, alarm on his face. However, Raiden shook his head. Kyuubi hadn't taken over Naruto in any way at all. Naruto glanced at the Junin over his shoulder, and Raiden nodded encouragingly. Naruto took a deep breath and formed a ram seal, murmuring, Kosui Junkai, under his breath as he did so. The air around Naruto shimmered for a moment and then the blonde stood before them, the high-level genjutsu he had apparently placed over himself gone. Sandame took the changes in with shocked and intrigued eyes. Naruto's face hadn't changed much, his whisker marks were darker and deeper, and his eyes had gained slit pupils. His ears had also tapered slightly at the top, and his hair had gained subtle red highlights. However, it was the two light blonde tails with white tips trailing behind the blonde that made Sandame speechless. One, tails? Jiraiya's voice was choked. Naruto smiled in amusement at their reactions. Raiden was the only one wholly unsurprised. Yes, tails. The more chakra of Kyuubi's I can use, the more tails I gain until I reach 9 tails as he did. Right now I can only handle around a small amount of his chakra, and only at extreme circumstances. For obvious reasons, I hid the tails when I came to Konoha. Sandame nodded. The villagers would have gone berserk if they had seen any sign of Kyuubi influencing Naruto in any way. He eyed the swaying tails with both amusement and shock. Hadn't he said when the blonde arrived that Naruto continued to surprise him? So, what does this make you? Kakashi asked in a near whisper. Naruto shrugged, his eyes cold, a half-breed, a Hanyu. Caught between the demons and the humans, his voice was flat and factual, with no bitterness hidden underneath the tone. It surprised Kakashi that Naruto could be so blasé about his whole transformation. Sandame took a deep breath and then asked, how long did it take the air process to complete? Naruto tapped his chin thoughtfully. I researched for about 3 years on how we could break the seal enough to let some of Kyuubi's essence, his substitution for blood, and regulate his chakra through the original seal. After that we decided to try it out. The first 2 times it didn't work, but the third time, when I was 11, was a success. Sandame nodded thoughtfully and another question occurred to him. Is Kyuubi still alive then? Naruto laughed, yes, as much as he can be. We didn't merge souls. We're still 2 separate beings locked in one body. I only got his chakra and blood, everything else is still his. How often does he interact with you? Sandame asked, concerned for the boy. Kyuubi was devious and underhanded, someone he didn't like to be around Naruto, whom he thought of as a grandson. Whenever he feels like it, or when my whining gets to be too much for him, Naruto said, amusement clear in his voice. The old furball complains, but he's helped me out. He started training me after we merged, mainly so I could get a better hold on the chakra he was regulating to me. Sandame nodded again, and rubbed a hand across his face. So many questions and explanations, and too little time. What happened after your meeting with Kyuubi, then? He asked calmly, taking his hand down and placing his pipe in his mouth. We went to Kei's no Kuni, Sanagakure specifically. We stayed there until the merging with Kyuubi finished bonding us. Naruto finished his taijutsu, and perfected his own style, a mix of mainly wind and water elements with some lightning and fire thrown in for surprise, Raiden continued. He finished most of his training in the sword, sai, and fan, and went deeper into learning the dagger, senbon, and shorter swords such as wakizashi. He learned more ninjutsu and increased his speed, strength, and stamina until it matched a high chunin. He also completed his third and fourth tests in Seal's apprenticeship. Sandaime raised an eyebrow, impressed. It seemed Naruto had come far under the tutelage of Raiden and Hisoka. Probably farther than he would have if he had stayed in Konoha, where no one would have been willing to teach him. It was also there that Hisoka died and I met my uncle for the first and last time. Naruto's voice was cool and his eyes were full of icy anger. Flashback. 10-year-old Uzumaki Naruto sighed as he followed Raiden over the sandy desert that surrounded Sanagakure for many miles. Hisoka had been called in for a mission, and Naruto had volunteered to come along, bored by too many days and nights with nothing but his research on the mad demon in his head to keep him company. Raiden had gone back to Konoha for one of his yearly reports, and Naruto didn't want to spend the next few days with Hisoka either. Hisoka had agreed, since the mission was a simple assassination. Currently they were a day from Sanagakure, and they would arrive at their destination, a lesser, civilian city, in around a half-day's time. Naruto glanced up, frowning. He could have sworn he had heard footsteps besides his own and Hisoka's, but when he looked around there was no one to be seen. Feeling the tiny hairs on the back of his neck stand up, Naruto swung around, positioned in a defensive crouch. Behind him, standing only feet away was a man. He was tall, with shaggy auburn red hair and dark brown eyes set deep in his sharp face. His dress was plain and brown civilian clothing, which surprisingly didn't make Naruto relax. Instead his eyes narrowed at the stranger. No civilian would have been able to sneak up on Hisoka and him both. They were extremely sensitive to their surroundings. This guy was more than he looked, Naruto was sure of it. Naruto-kun? What is? Hisoka's voice cut off abruptly when he saw the man Naruto was glaring at. He looked familiar, but Hisoka couldn't place him. Huffing slightly he placed a hand on the blonde child's shoulder, relieved when Naruto relaxed somewhat. However he kept his guard up. The fox container was uncannily good at reading people, and if Naruto was still wary of the stranger, then he had good reason to be. "Can we help you, sir?" Hisoka called out pleasantly to the man. Dark brown eyes turned to him, studying him intently until the stranger dismissed the samurai, turning to stare at Naruto once more. "Uzumaki Naruto, correct?" he asked in a raspy voice that sounded like it hadn't been used in years. Naruto's eyes narrowed again and he tensed up. "Who wants to know?" he asked boldly. Hisoka mentally groaned. Naruto's mouth was going to get him in trouble one day. But the stranger chuckled dryly. "You have Kushina's spirit boy and Minato's recklessness. A dangerous combination." Naruto's eyes widened. "You knew my parents?" The man nodded slowly. "My name is Uzumaki Ryoma. I'm your uncle." Naruto's eyes widened and he took a step backwards, running into Hisoka. Ryoma laughed outright at that, but there was no warmth in it, only dry neutrality. Hisoka was also staring at Ryoma in shock. Now he knew why the man had looked so familiar, but he noticed when Naruto began to shake lightly and placed a hand on his shoulder. He stared down at the blonde's bent head, concerned. What about his uncle scared Naruto so much? You, Naruto stuttered out, trying to get his brain working again so he could find something to say. "How dare you come here?" Ryoma's voice was devoid of emotion, but his eyes were sparking with something unpleasant. Naruto shuddered again, knowing that this man had been the one to set Kyuubi off, the one to set the fox demon's sights on Konoha. "Don't worry, little nephew, I didn't come to beg for your forgiveness. I would like to know how you know of it, but I suppose you wouldn't tell me no matter how many times I asked," Ryoma said with a dark sneer on his face. Naruto breathed in deeply, and tried to find the courage that had helped him when he met with Kyuubi. Slowly he lifted his eyes to meet Ryoma's, and his uncle could see an edge of steel in the blue. He smiled, and Naruto had the funny feeling that the man was smiling truly for once. It's good to know Kushina's spirit lives on. Ryoma took a step forward, which prompted Hisoka, who had been quietly watching their reunion, to put Naruto behind him. Ryoma gave him a blank look and continued to make his way to the pair, any amount of emotion that had been behind his previous smile gone from both his face and his eyes. "You cannot save him, Ryu Hisoka-san," Ryoma said quietly, and he disappeared only to reappear again behind Naruto. Hisoka turned instantly and blocked the sword that would have come swinging down upon the blonde's head. Naruto didn't look afraid, but Hisoka wasn't really surprised by that. Whenever the blonde gathered his courage, it was impossible for him to give it up until the battle ended. Hisoka looked up into Ryoma's eyes, face deadly and serious. "You will not touch him." Ryoma's mouth twisted somewhere in between a sneer and a smirk as he lifted his blade away from Hisoka's only to attack again, this time quicker. Naruto, however, had seen it coming and rolled out of the way, springing back up into a defensive position. Hisoka instantly moved in on Ryoma, his eyes narrow and his sword fast and deadly. Ryoma growled when he was unable to get at Naruto due to having to defend himself from Hisoka's attacks, but then his eyes gleamed. Doing the seals behind his back with his left hand while he continued to fight with Hisoka, Ryoma waited until the opportune moment. When the samurai took a second to catch his breath, he instantly murmured, "Hitobashiri no Jutsu." Instantly Ryoma appeared behind Naruto, quickly wrapping an arm around the brat's waist. Hisoka whirled around and stilled when he saw the katana's sharpened edge lying against his apprentice's neck. Ryoma smirked at the despair he could read on the samurai's face, and the tense terror he could sense in his long-lost nephew. Now before that rude interruption, he said coolly, "I was about to tell you why I came out after you after all this time. You see, I had heard rumors of a blonde named Uzumaki Naruto in Kiri, and I decided to go back to my dear hometown to see if they were true. If I really did have a nephew. However, before I could go to the Hokage, I happened to hear a certain guard celebrating the last search for the demon brat. Curious to know who this demon brat was, I asked some innocent questions. To my great surprise, I learned that Naruto is Kyuubi no Kitsune." "No!" Naruto yelled out, his stillness suddenly broken by violent thrashing. "I'm not Kyuubi, I was never Kyuubi. I'm his Contanior, his holder. I would never be him." Ryoma looked down at the blonde head in surprise for a second until cool distaste slid over his features. He smirked and tightened the katana at the brat's neck, rewarded by the sharp intake of breath from the samurai and Naruto's sudden stilling. "Now if I may continue," Hisoka murmured. "I instantly set out to find you Uzumaki Naruto, and it took me a year to do so. And now, by killing you, Kyuubi will be dead once and for all, and my vengeance for my village will be fulfilled." The desert was quiet for a moment until Naruto spoke, his voice as low as a whisper. "Why avenge a village that is destroyed?" Ryoma growled and whirled Naruto around, glaring into bright blue eyes and shaking the boy's thin shoulders. "They should have been your village as well. Your monster destroyed them, the families, the crops, the houses, everything. If Kyuubi hadn't destroyed that village in aim, then they wouldn't have had a reason to attack us." Naruto's eyes were flat. "Your family wouldn't want this. My mother wouldn't want you to kill her son." Ryoma's face tightened in rage. "Kushina should have wanted it. She should have been there with me, both of us getting our revenge. But Konoha made her weak, soft-hearted. She couldn't stomach vengeance anymore." Hisoka watched the two converse, slowly sneaking up to them. He could tell what Naruto was doing. He was distracting Ryoma into a rage so that Hisoka would have the chance to sneak up and kill the man. Kushina's brother was obviously somewhat insane, though Hisoka couldn't blame him. Losing a village was the worst thing that could happen to anyone in the elemental countries. She should have never married that good-for-nothing blonde. All he did was drag her down into the dumps, where the rest of Konoha was. Ryoma said, still ranting in Naruto's face. The blonde looked impassive, but Hisoka caught a spark of fire in his eyes and smiled to himself. Insults against his father and his village, even if Naruto didn't like it much, weren't tolerated by the blonde. Hisoka was only feet away when Ryoma whirled around, growling, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Hisoka froze. The katana that had previously been at Naruto's neck now swung in his direction, its tilted point directly facing his heart. Before Hisoka had the chance to move or say anything, Ryoma plunged the sword into chest. He died instantly. Naruto watched in horror as Hisoka's lifeless body fell to the ground, his normally fierce dark blue eyes dulling. Time seemed to stop for a moment, and the blonde could only hear the blood pounding in his ears, and the shocked terror that Hisoka's death had brought. His body felt numb and clumsy, his breath wheezing in and out. Then time started again and Hisoka's body fell to the ground with a thump. Naruto could never remember rightly what happened after that. He remembered turning, screaming words lost in his memory, to Ryoma and kicking, clawing, and biting any place he could reach, like his meeting with Hisoka so long ago. He could remember the raw pain and anger Hisoka's death had brought, and the endless need to make Ryoma pay. He could remember the flailing katana that had nearly sliced his head off a number of times. The rest was a blank, a sea of endless blurred memories all overlapping each other. When he came back to himself, he was kneeling next to Ryoma's corpse, whose eyes had been nearly scratched out by Naruto's sharp claw-like nails. The ragged katana slash across his neck had been the thing to kill him, but Naruto had made sure to make the man suffer. Stumbling and clumsy, he made his way to Hisoka's corpse. He more fell than knelt next to his old sensei. He took in the samurai clothes Hisoka had always loved to wear, the tangled silver-white hair, dirty from desert weather and blood, and the paling blue of the still open eyes. Naruto sat there, staring at his sensei for a long while until he finally gave up trying to hold it in and dry heaved on the ground next to him, trying to get rid of the disgust and helpless horror at the sight. He had seen death before, but to see it masked over Hisoka's face, which had always been so warm, was horrifying for him. Naruto laid in the sand next to the dead body of his sensei for a long time. He didn't want to have to get up, to walk back and explain to Raiden. He wanted to lie here for as long as possible, bury his head in the sand, and hope that maybe the pain would go away. End flashback. The Hokage's room was silent. Naruto's face was closed and shuttered, but his eyes were full of the quiet grief of those who have accepted their loved ones passing. Raiden was also like this, but instead of showing his emotions plainly in his eyes, he hid them behind a mask of ice. Kakashi looked grieved. He had known Hisoka, and to hear about his death in such a way shocked and saddened him. Jiraiya watched Naruto with old, compassionate eyes, wishing that the boy would have never had to go through something like that. Sandaime, too, watched Naruto. He had had no idea that Hisoka had died, and by the blonde's own uncle. And to think that Naruto had killed using only his bare hands and the lucky strike of a flailing katana. His love for his precious ones was deep, like any good namikaze. He wished that Naruto would have been spared that pain, but he knew that sometimes a person was forced to go through terrible situations such as Naruto's. He hesitated before speaking, wondering if he was pushing too fast. However, it was getting late and they needed to finish Naruto's story, so he said, "And, after that, Naruto-kun?" The somber tension in the room was high as Naruto smiled bitterly. "Why then, Jiji-sama, we had a funeral." Flashback. It should have been raining. That was the only thought on Naruto's mind as he stared over the crowds of people appearing around the grave. Hisoka's funeral should have been an affair of pouring rain, where the very heavens themselves cried out for the death of such a man. But the weather mocked Naruto by being warm and sunny, the sky without a single cloud in it and the sun beating down upon their heads. There were a lot of people coming. Samurais, made obvious by their clothes, were the main crowd, with a few civilians scattered among them. Raiden stood off to the side, golden eyes dark and sad. Naruto looked away. It had, in some ways, hurt more to see Raiden suffer than to feel his own grief. The crowd's whispers died down as an old monk stood in front of Hisoka's grave, which Hisoka's casket was slowly being lowered into via crane. The monk murmured some words and crossed himself, before bowing low to the grave in thanks for a life well lived, too. He then turned to the crowd and called out, "Is there any among us who would like to speak about this man before we let him down into his grave?" No one spoke for a minute until Naruto said in a choked voice, "I will speak." The monk nodded, sympathy in his dark eyes as he saw the pain in Naruto's face. He stepped aside, robe swishing, and the blonde took his place at the head of grave. He stared out at the expectant faces, eyes weary and grieved. "Ryu Hisoka was my sensei," he started slowly. There were some sympathetic looks and shushed whispers until he went on again. "He was a brave, compassionate person who never gave up and never backed down. He also smoked cigarettes, even when I asked him not to, got himself into reckless situations for the fun of it, and was blindsided by his need to save people." There were some gasps at how disrespectful Naruto was being at his own sensei's funeral, but the blonde ignored them. "He was a person. He lived and loved, and now he is dead. I loved him as a brother and a mentor, and the image of his face will be carved into my heart for my entire life. I ask you to remember him, to never forget Ryu Hisoka, and perhaps, someday in the future we will be able to leave our grief behind us and move on. For now, though, I will cry for a man's life cut off in its prime and for the death of someone who I loved very dearly." The crowd was silent as Naruto went back to his place. The monk spoke several more chants and prayed over the grave one last time before he bowed to the people, asking them to leave so the casket could be lowered in solitude. The crowd drifted away and Naruto moved to a tree at the edge of the graveyard, leaning against it and closing his eyes. He breathed in and out, trying to control his breathing. His speech had been hasty and jumbled, but it was what he felt. Pouring out that kind of emotion left his heart aching. He looked up when he felt a hand land on his head, and Raiden was looking down at him with understanding eyes. Naruto gave him a faint smile and then hoisted himself to his feet. The two walked back to the newly dug grave to give one last talk to their friend and comrade. End flashback. Everyone's heads were bowed as Naruto finished summing up the memory. Even Raiden looked depressed after this one. Sandaime was watching Naruto with sad and proud eyes. To think that he had come through that hard point in his life and was moving on. He was a remarkable boy. Minato would have been proud. Then, Kakashi's voice was soft and heavy, and Naruto stared at his bowed head for a long moment with compassion. Then the blonde sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Then we went to Rai no Kuni and we stayed there until I decided to travel back to Konoha. I had to relearn chakra control so I could keep my new chakra in check, and after that I perfected my sword and taijutsu styles, learned more ninjutsu, learned more about stealth and interrogation techniques, started to a fan style, learned codes, increased my speed and strength, learned various strategies, and finished my 5th level in seals. Naruto continued on. Earlier in the month Raiden asked if I wished to return to Konoha to become a genin. I agreed, but Raiden stayed behind to close things up for us and sit around on his lazy ass. Here a glare was given to a scowling Raiden. While I was traveling I met Jiraiya, who was peeping, like usual, and I apparently became his apprentice without realizing it. The rest, Gigi-sama, you know. Sandaime nodded and he started to connect all the information about Naruto's skills that the blonde had given him. Naruto was obviously skilled in weaponry and taijutsu, was probably good in ninjutsu as well due to his large chakra, and was skilled in seals. Overall he was fairly balanced out, with weak points in genjutsu, interrogation, and probably strategy. I'd say you are somewhere between a high-level chunin and a middle-level junin due to your hard work and years of training, Sandaime mused thoughtfully. However, you'll have to stay with your team right now. You can't become a chunin without taking the exams at least once. I will do my best to give you all challenging missions, mainly for Naruto-kun and Sasuke-kun's sake. As far as I can tell Sakura-chan doesn't wish to have dangerous missions. The old man gave a humorless chuckle. The poor girl's going to get a wake-up call soon. Naruto nodded during Sandaime's speech, only a little surprised to hear that he ranked so high. Kakashi and Jiraiya were both gaping, and Raiden was smirking with pride for his student, not that he'd ever admit it. Naruto looked out the window and was surprised to see that the moon was starting to rise. His story must have taken longer than he thought. Slowly he raised himself to his feet and bowed shallowly to Sandaime. May we go now, Gigi-sama? I need to sleep because some fool Junin sensei of mine decided to have our genin test at 6:30 a.m. Kakashi chuckled nervously, his previous shock forgotten at his student's acid tone and sharp glare. Sandaime smiled at the two and Raiden and Jiraiya both watched in gleeful amusement, both having been attacked by Naruto's sharp tongue before. Yes, you may go, Naruto-kun, Sandaime said with a chuckle. I didn't realize that it was so late. Naruto nodded and went over to Raiden, whispering in his ear. The older man nodded a few times until Naruto sent him a smile and then going over to Jiraiya to whisper in his ear. Kakashi, annoyed by being kept out of the loop, watched the three with a frown. I'll see you in the morning, Kaka-sensei. Naruto chirped happily, pulling Raiden out of the door after him. The three men left inside stared after them for a minute until Sandaime shook his head and took another puff out of his pipe. That boy never changes. Sleeping alone, except under doctor's orders, does much harm. Children will tell you how lonely it is sleeping alone. If possible, you should always sleep with someone you love. You both recharge your mutual batteries free of charge. Marlene Dietrich. Naruto and Raiden sped to Training Ground 7, both enjoying the night wind rushing to meet them and the free speed they were traveling at. However, the run stopped all too soon, as the pair approached the training ground. Naruto's sharp eyes sought out a good tree in the dark night and smiled as he saw one, a large oak with thick, strong branches that were broad enough to hold a man twice his size. Quickly he motioned to Raiden and the two made their way up to the tree, each settling on their individual branch for some sleep. Ever since his merging with Kyuubi, Naruto had always felt more comfortable sleeping outside, especially in a wooded area. Trees were the best spots, where he always got the most restful sleep. The blonde attributed as a fox thing and left it at that. Since Raiden didn't mind sleeping outside either, and neither of them liked to be apart for long after Hisoka's death, they usually found a tree and slept outside together. Naruto felt more than saw the black creeping over the edges of his eyes and smiled. Before long he was peacefully asleep, Raiden nearby, with the moon rising steadily above Konoha.
That's all for now. If you enjoy this video, then please like, share and do comments.